following series of entries have been pulled verbatim from Chapter 1 of the 3rd edition source book, Eberron, The Forge of War. They present a chronological overview of the major events of the century-long conflict that was the Last War. The discourse is taken primarily from an introductory textbook used at Soldas College of the Library of Corenberg, as annotated by the renowned Zill librarian Augusta Wainwackett. As close to an impartial source as can be found, commentary taken directly from this source will be interspersed throughout the document, presented in italic type. As such, I encourage you all to use this source as though it were an in-universe historical source. The Course of War. Though the land called Gallifrey was nominally a kingdom, it stretched across an entire continent. King Jarrett was a king among kings, and his children answered only to him. The blood of Gallifrey used society's ties, lightning rails, message stations, crucial rivers and caravan routes to keep the realm unified, peaceful, and rich. Treasure flowed into its coffers, and its armies gleamed with arms and armor capable of holding off the forces of any invader. The few nations around the edges of Gallifrey, such as the Lazar Principalities and the Demon Wastes, posed no real threat to its citizens. They were distant foes, easily ignored. The great danger to this empire was not outside its borders, it was within.
Gallifrey was an empire in everything but name, and empires don't die well. The recital in these pages attempts the monumental task of summarizing over 100 years of history spread across an entire continent. Unfortunately, a great deal of information about the Last War was lost in the continual upheaval, chaos, and bloodshed. Recounts of these years are buried in layers of propaganda, speculation, insinuation, accusation, and paranoia. Likely, no one in Corvair will ever know the entire truth. These pages represent our librarians' best efforts to piece together voluminous and oft-times contradictory accounts. If nothing else, this work seeks to combat the old falsehoods that are repeated endlessly to justify lasting animosity. It is hoped that commentaries such as this one will aid in elucidation and engender continued study.
Roots of the Last War. At its root, the Last War was a war of succession. The dispute that sparked the conflict was over which of King Jarrett's 5 children would ascend to the throne of Gallifrey after his death. According to almost 9 centuries of tradition, that honor should have gone to Mishan, Jarrett's eldest and the ruler of Sire. Upon King Jarrett's death, Mishan's brothers and sister would abdicate their rule of the other nations, and Mishan's children would be installed as governor princes of the 5 nations. That was how succession had been handled for the entire history of Gallifrey. Instead, Thalen, Caius, and Roran rejected Mishan's succession. Their refusal to respect a central tradition that had kept the Empire unified for nearly 1,000 years sparked a war.
Many lay the blame for a century of warfare at the feet of the 3 rebellious scions, but such a view is far too simplistic. A closer look reveals deeper causes for conflict, causes that stretch back in time at least to the unification of Gallifrey itself. Before Gallifrey I's unification wars, Corvair was dominated, though not entirely controlled, by 5 independent nation-states. In the southwest, the nation of Rot had been founded by Bregor First King in the area of present-day Vatharond. Its people journeyed south and engulfed the once independent city-state of Sharat, now called Sharn. Far to the north, the nation of Thaliost stretched across the coastline and down into the waterway that would come to be known as Scion's Sound. Southwest of Thaliost, Daskara stretched across fertile plains. In the southeast, the small but wealthy nation of Seaside had grown up around Kraken Bay and expanded northward. To the northeast, the descendants of Karn the Conqueror ruled a nation that bore his name. These separate kingdoms had existed for thousands of years and had evolved fiercely nationalistic cultures. Although Gallifrey I united the 5 realms and thus succeeded where Karn had failed, it is no real surprise that his accomplishment was temporary. He and his heirs clearly never eliminated the ingrained attitudes that led people to think of themselves first as Carns, Ondarians, Thrains, Sirens, or Braelish, and only secondarily as citizens of Galifar. Indeed, his succession practice of placing the ruler's children at the head of the 5 principalities served to reinforce the ancient divisions. When crisis came, the people and the rulers easily fell back on old viewpoints, drawing lines between themselves and their neighbors based on borders over 2,000 years old.
The tender twig of succession ignited a vast powder keg. Galifar had long been on a war footing. For much of his reign, King Jarrett was terrified of war. He devoted most of his considerable talents to enhancing his kingdom's defenses. He perceived no end of threats, conspiracies involving the dragon-marked houses, plots among aristocracy of his realm, imminent invasion from Erenal, a draconic scourge from Argonnessen. He feared the inspired of Rydra, though he knew almost nothing about them, and dreaded the mysteries of Zendrick. Jarrett's fears fed a military buildup the likes of which Corvair had never before seen. Each area bristled with armaments. Jarrett instigated the research that would eventually lead to the modern Warforged, and himself lived to see the first construct soldiers arrayed amid his armies. At his command, House Caneth began work on the mobile fortresses that culminated in the deployment of Braelin's floating strongholds. With the king's urging and approval, House Daneth heavily recruited mercenaries from among the continent's more monstrous species. In hindsight, Jarrett's mental state appears to have been imbalanced. At the time, however, none could challenge his viewpoints, and few had any interest in doing so.
What caused Jarrett's nightmarish preoccupation with an invasion from beyond his kingdom? There are many answers. Some claim an insidious alien entity caused Jarrett's madness. They say that the being infiltrated the king's dreams and planted the seeds of his paranoid imaginings. If that were the case, though, why did no outside force intervene in the war once it began? Others claim that the true threat to Galifar came from the demon wastes. They posit a force of entropy and destruction that spreads from Ashtakala, the city of ghosts, along pathways as much spiritual as material, corrupting every empire and bringing it to eventual ruin. This profoundly ahistorical view treats the fall of Galifar as an event unaffected by any immediate circumstances except the constant influx of a long-dead city of demons. Finally, a few claim the Scion's complicity is far deeper than suspected. The 5 rulers all conspired at one time or another to spread doubts about the strength of the kingdom to their father. Their insecurity and selfishness fed Jarrett's tendencies, exacerbating the tension and increasing the military power at their disposal. All of these theories have one characteristic in common. They are searching for a deeper explanation for something that seems inexplicable. In truth, the people of Corvair had spent nearly a half-century expecting war to erupt on their shores at any moment. Under the weight of that expectation, it would have been surprising if war had not broken out.
894. The war begins. Jarrett's eldest scion was his daughter Mishan, who ruled Sire. The second oldest was Thalin of Thrain. He was widely rumored to be considered for the title of regent, since Mishan had been a bit wild in her youth, wild enough to frighten some of the more staid nobles of the realm. Thus, both Mishan and Thalin thought they might be named supreme ruler. King Jarrett gave only Mishan his blessing when he lay on his deathbed in Thronehold. The king bade his son Rogar of Ondare, who was there at the time, to support his choice. Rogar gave an oath to his father. Thalin, Caius of Carnath, and Rowan of Breland were not present at the king's death, and were bound by no similar pledges. At Jarrett's state funeral shortly thereafter, Mishan approached her siblings to discuss the details of her coronation as Queen of Galifar. Thalin, Caius, and Rowan refused to listen, rejecting her succession. They vowed to pit their personal guards against any such action. Roan, in particular, declared that it was time for increased liberty and democracy, and that hidebound compliance with tradition was inappropriate. Rogar backed Mishan's claim, but the two of them had insufficient forces or, at the time, desire to exert their will on their siblings. The siblings and their retinues quit Thronehold, with the succession issue wholly unresolved. In late 894, Mishan formally declared herself Queen of Sire and united Galifar from her capital. She also gave her blessing to Rogar's announcement that he would assume the title of King of Aundair. Queen Mishan then instructed her strongest supporters to gather at the port of Eston to sail to Thronehold. She sought coronation over the whole realm when she reached the island, but, in truth, invited only the nobles of Aundair and Sire to attend. Breland, Thrain, and Karnath issued separate declarations challenging Mishan's claim to the imperial island. The rulers each decreed that they too would henceforth be known as kings and queens. King Thalin and King Roan mustered their house guards and previously retained mercenaries. Thrain and Breland were ready to fight, in small numbers at least, within days. King Caius declared martial law and began mobilizing his warlord, but Karnathi forces were still gathering when the outriders of his allies arrived on the shores of Sion's Sound. Even without Caius's forces, Thrain and Breland troops outnumbered the opposition. Aundair and Sire had been unable to combine their army. Indeed, Rogar was rallying his beloved rangers from the Eldine hinterlands when he learned that Thalin and Roan were marching to stop Mishan from claiming Thronehold. Reaching Eston without incident, Mishan set sail with a fleet largely composed of transports and merchant ships. Mishan did not expect her siblings to escalate the conflict into a shooting war. Still, when her vessels reached the area around Thronehold, the lookouts reported a powerful force arrayed against her. Thalin had ordered the bulk of his ships to blockade the island. The advanced elements met, and the allies began attacking. Mishan realized then she would be forced to fight. Rather than risk her entire force on the waves, she turned her ships and slid into the southwestern leg of Sion's Sound. The few Thrain ships patrolling Flamekeep's harbor refused to challenge Sire, and the Thrain navy, with orders to secure Thronehold, did not pursue. Mishan was able to bring her troops safely to land near Traylin Bridge, south of Flamekeep. There, she learned of the combined Thrain and Brelish army moving to intercept her. Knowing she was outnumbered, she turned north, seeking to cross into Aundair and link up with Rogar.
894. Battle of the Gallifare Heirs. The first major engagement of the war was fought on the western shore of Sion's Sound, just south of Flamekeep. By moving quickly, Thalin and Roan caught the outmanned forces of Sire as they gathered on the road west of Traylin Bridge. Thalin was eager to strike the first blow. He, after all, spoke the loudest against the succession, claiming his divine right of kingship. He was also on his home ground. With 500 heavy foot, 800 light knights, and 2,000 peasant levies at his command, he was by far the most dominating force. Breland brought only the Queen's swords and an elite force of 150 heavy foot, and the Free Company of Archers, a group of 200 longbowmen. In all, the newly declared Queen of Gallifare faced over 3,500 enemies. By contrast, Sire had mustered only the 200 elite cavalry of the Queen's Guard and only 500 heavy halberdiers of her honor guard. In hostile territory, far from the Aundarian border, Mishan realized that she would be decimated whether she fled or stood her ground. Still, she prepared to sell herself and her forces dearly. Miraculously, Rogar's Wardens of the Wood arrived at the Sire camp by magical means, passing without trace to appear in full battle order. His forces included some 1,000 elves, druids, and centaurs. Although the loyalist forces were still outnumbered, the outcome of the battle was no longer a foregone conclusion. The two armies lined up, heralds met and exchanged challenges, and finally, about noon, the armies clashed. The Queen's swords of Breland engaged directly with the Queen's guard of Sire, and a rumor circulated that Roan had been slain. She had only been wounded. The Ondarian forces rained arrows and magic upon Thrain's peasant levies, and the undisciplined troops soon broke and ran. Still, Sire and Ondare had no answer for Thalin's heavy cavalry, some of the best troops on the continent. Their thunderous charge after the peasants smashed into the left flank of the Sire army and scattered the wardens of the wood. The arrival of Ondare's forces, led by their ferocious bear-like king, had made the difference, however. His troops allowed Sire to retreat in good order to the south. The next morning, the forces of Caius arrived too late. The militant Karens had missed the first battle, much to their new king's displeasure. His riders pursued the Siren and Ondarian forces, but to no avail. Michonne and her remaining troops crossed the Sound north of Arldusk and reformed in the fortress at Eston. The Queen ordered most of the army to hold the city, maintaining it as a staging ground, ensuring that House Cainith's base of operations remained intact, and preserving access to the crucial iron and adamantine sources. She then returned to Matral to oversee the mustering of greater armies.
As mentioned, Galifar was divided into semi-autonomous regions throughout its history. Still, centuries of unity did have an impact on the politics and economics of the continent. A full understanding of the course of the war, particularly its early years, requires a discussion of those interdependencies. Much has been written about Carnathi military prowess. It has long been the defining feature of that nation. The most influential military minds of Galifar were schooled in the military academy at Rechenmark before the war. This meant that strategy and tactics, much of it derived from the writings of Karn the Conqueror and his Analects of War, were relatively uniform throughout the land. Carnath also produced steadfast and hard-working laborers. Although led by others in most cases, many of Galifar's major construction projects, including the miles of lightning rail, owe a great deal to Karn workers. Carnath's greatest weakness was food. Although competent producers of meat, wine, and dairy products, Carnath's people were highly dependent on grains and other imports from elsewhere in Corvair. Ondarian excellence was as renowned as Carnathi arms, particularly in the area of magic. Embodied by the Arcane Congress, Ondare has long been a symbol of arcane accomplishments. Less well known, but no less important, were the skilled Ondarian workers. True crafters and scholars in nearly every field could be found among the villages of that northern nation. Ondare was also one of the two bread baskets of Galifar. The Eldine Reaches and those lands bordering it have always been bountiful. The nation's greatest weakness were a small population and an arrogance among its leaders. This situation resulted in a significant cultural divide between the gentry of the west and those closer to the natural order in the east. Thrain, the other major pre-war exporter of foodstuffs, saw itself as the heart of Galifar. Centrally located, its vastly fertile land overflowed with dedicated and passionate people. For the most part, a nation of farmers, the populace embraced the new religion of the Silver Flame and attempted to bring good into all aspects of their lives. At times intolerant, Thrain was more often generous and gregarious. Although the Knights of Thrain formed a proud and elite force, the country was not strong militarily. No natural barriers existed, and the majority of its people saw no need to make the tough sacrifices that others, particularly the Karns, saw as part of their daily life. Breland had long kept itself apart from the majority of Galifar. Despite boasting the continent's largest city, Breland was considered a relatively backward and unfashionable place. A Siren poet named it a nation of tinkerers and free-thinkers. For their part, the Braelish saw the other nations as overly bound by tradition and far too concerned with appearances. Then again, Breland could afford to adopt an outsider's perspective. Her abundant lands contained fertile fields and vast resources. The nation boasted widespread light industry and a large and skilled labor force. Self-sufficiency was the Braelish creed. Braelin's weaknesses stemmed from her lack of interest or understanding of the other nations, and her reluctance to involve herself in outside affairs. Truly, Braeland was the sleeping giant of Galifar. Wondrous Sire was the soul of Galifar. Siren appreciation spread the length and breadth of the continent, setting standards and aspirations for everyone who considered themselves a part of the Empire. Bards, poets, writers, artisans, and scholars poured out a constant stream of creative endeavors, some of them truly brilliant. This cultural hegemony was matched in the area of diplomacy and negotiation. Siren administrators, liaisons, and judges could be found throughout Galifar, settling disputes and bridging divides. Sire also contained sufficiently fertile lands, and, given the House Cainith home city of Eston, her top-level industry was unmatched. On the other hand, the nation was weak militarily, relying on local police forces, Deneth mercenaries, and Karrnathi soldiers to keep the peace. It was also supremely arrogant. It was accustomed to issuing orders and having others comply. Thus was the Empire interconnected. Against this background, the last war was fought.
895, diplomacy's first failures. Thinking that a negotiated settlement might still be possible, Mishan sought an end to the fighting. She and Rogar proposed a simple partition into 2 or 3 kingdoms. Caius, as yet deprived of the glory of battle, sabotaged the entire effort, urging his allies to reject the treaties. The only lasting result of the months of peace-seeking was to allow expatriates from every nation to return home, some just ahead of overzealous locals. The talks broke off when Thrain, Karrnath, and Braeland laid siege to the city of Eston in the first extended campaign of the war. Thalen wanted no more Sire expeditions launching themselves from that port, and was concerned with the force already established there. The siege initially went well for the 3 allies, since Thrain and Braeland controlled the sea lanes. The bulk of Ondarian navy was engaged with Karrnath in a struggle for control in the north. Still, House Cainith was responsible for much of the city's buildings and defense works, and not surprisingly, the dragon-marked house had rendered the city nigh impregnable. When Rogar's rangers staged yet another unexpected arrival in the west and cut the lightning rail supplies at the Arldusk station, a lack of supplies began limiting the attackers' ability to launch sustained assaults. Ultimately, the siege was doomed when the 3 usurpers began quarreling about who would sit upon the Galifar throne. Thalen had already declared his divine right to the crown, and Rowan supported that claim, but only because she was promised greater liberties for all citizens and offered the title of Queen of Braeland and Sire. Caius rejected Thalen's claim, declaring that he, from the land of Karn and Galifar, should inherit the crown. With the continued raids on their supply lines, distrust engendered by Caius's refusal to pledge himself to Thalen, word of a strong Siren force approaching, and a powerful sally by the emboldened city garrison, Thrain and Braeland decided to cross back over to Sion Sound and abandon the siege in 896. Unable to maintain the stranglehold himself, Caius was forced to withdraw. Again, he was denied honorable battle. The armies of Karrnath plundered and burned their way across northern Sire in a fury, but retreated in the face of Siren cavalry and heavy foot who threatened Caius's extended supply lines.
This falling out at the first siege of Eston would prove to be merely the first of many. All of Jarrett's children had been born to rule, and had gained experience as rulers within the larger Galifar Empire. Each had supporters and plans for their own elevation to the throne. In truth, all 5 scions of Jarrett were ill-tempered and accustomed to having things their way. All had their excuses for hanging on to power, varying from divine right to greater experience to Jarrett's favor to the defense of freedom and liberty. Jarrett had encouraged his children to become powerful rulers, and he did not recognize that national and personal interests had aligned against the continued control of the Empire from thronehold. The extreme stubbornness of Jarrett's children set many precedents, and weakened any attempt at diplomacy throughout the years to come.
895. Thalin's Vision. Fueled by religious fervor, King Thalin believed his destiny to rule was far more than just Thrain. He could rely on powerful allies in the Church of the Silver Flame, and the feeling among the nobles of Thalin's court reinforced his sense of entitlement to the throne. Mishan was no more worthy, and far less pious, than he was. The people of Sire, with their debauchery and their emphasis on fashion rather than wisdom, could not possibly have produced a woman worthy of the throne. Even so, the nobles, the church, and the people were divided over how to proceed. Everyone looked for someone or something to confirm Thalin's claim. Most desirable would be a divine mandate or a proclamation from the ruling body of the Church of the Silver Flame, the Diet of Cardinals. The group was much too shrewd and conservative to take such a bold step, however. Thalin decided that he must act first. He needed to improve his secret network of informers, and so he quietly appointed a spy master. The newly proclaimed king also asked his most trusted dukes and barons to significantly expand their army. More publicly, he decided to strengthen his ties to the church, so he underwent a ritual cleansing and vigil at the heart of the church. For 20 days, good King Thalin fasted and prayed. On the 20th day, he experienced a vision of the Coatl, enfolding him in silvery feathers, opening his eyes, and showing him a land where silver fires sprang up in the eyes, hearts, and minds of every soul. He knew then that it was his destiny to bring the flame to all. Mishan's succession was not just a mistake, it was blasphemy. The proclamation of Thalin's vision caused immediate controversy throughout Galifar. Why didn't Javor Darin, the Keeper of the Flame for over 20 years, experience this vision? The prelate's power and skill had been tested, trusted, and understood for decades. Others saw nothing amiss with the flame granting the king spiritual strength. War loomed, and divine aid was most welcome. Cynics and skeptics, even within the church itself, discounted the pronouncement, mocking it as Thalin's convenient vision of infallibility. The Keeper, a close family friend to the king, and the cardinals did not formally condone Thalin's vision, but neither did they reject it. Internal debate over Thalin's vision all but ceased when the Ondare moved aggressively, striking south along the shores of Lake Galifar. Ondarian forces quickly overran the least populated of Thrain's territories, an area south of the passage to the Black Caps and west from the lake to Galt. King Rogar's forces, under the command of Haldren Ir-Barsak, even took Crag War briefly. The Arcane Congress at Arcanix raised no objection to the Ondarian occupation, instead declaring itself a non-combatant. A hastily organized and weak counterstrike by Thrain recaptured Crag War, but was otherwise easily repulsed. This was but the first of countless battles that would bathe the land around Galt in blood.
Thalin's vision marked the beginning of what has come to be regarded as a dark time in Thrain history, even by those currently administrating the theocratic nation. In truth, Thalin's description is not on its face overly dire nor at odds with common church rhetoric. The Church of the Silver Flame has long sought to embrace all Corvarians, viewing such widespread faith as a cornerstone to achieving a living paradise. The real conflict has always centered on the means to this goal. While some within the Church emphasize teaching and acceptance to bring outsiders to its truths, others stir intolerant passion and mandate conversion. The history of the Church of the Silver Flame is defined by the struggle between these two approaches.
896 through 905. Karrnath reversals. At the start of the war, Karrnath's standing army was larger, better trained, and better equipped, and had higher morale than any of its neighbors. Still, it failed to put a quick end to the war, partially because of its underestimation of Ondarian audacity and Siren toughness, and partly because of pure bad luck, as a horrific series of national catastrophes racked the land. Caius's travails began in 896, the year of the long winter, which featured a largely non-existent spring growing season and failed harvests across the land. The cities of Carnath, cut off from the bounty of the Eldine reaches, deprived by hoarding and thrain, and considered a lower priority than the armies, began to starve. Sire's nobles along the southern border, hearing of supply difficulties, launched a series of surprise attacks against the less fortified areas, primarily targeting logistics. Although discipline remained strict and desertion was minimal, the vast might of Carnath was effectively paralyzed by a lack of provisions. For a time, the borders remained intact, primarily as a result of a new band of warriors, the Order of the Emerald Claw, which emphasized flexibility, self-sufficiency, honor, and accomplishment regardless of sacrifice. The most imaginative of Kharan military personnel broke ranks to join the Emerald Claw and paid a heavy price for their independent ways. But a legend arose that would serve the order well in the years to come. The spring of 897 was just as bad. Carnath held the lines against Assyrian raids, but Caius needed an offensive victory to keep his restless nobles in line. Viewing the Ondarians as weak, he launched an assault across the White Ark Bridge and even secured Thaulist for a time. This gave Carnes a badly needed triumph and restored morale for a time, but the critical shortages in food undermined everything. Fearing a complete collapse if the true extent of the failed harvests became known, Caius withdrew his troops and set them to controlling his own populace. In this dark hour, the blood of Vol, long a fixture in Carnathi religious life, offered previously unknown resources. Fresh food began arriving in the cities. Miraculously, the harvest proved far less dire than predicted. Church attendance skyrocketed, and a number of prominent members of the famous Order of the Emerald Claw were seen at services. Carnath remained severely weakened, but the specter of mass starvation receded. Even King Caius seemed to have been granted a new lease on life, appearing at citizen rallies and troop entrenchments throughout the country. It was said that the king drove himself relentlessly, refusing all but the briefest periods of rest while his country was imperiled.
A number of historians, principally outside Carnath's borders, raise dark questions about the Blood of Vol's intervention in the Northern Kingdom. They point to the remarkable reversal in food supplies and the enormous upswing in Blood of Vol fervor as evidence that the Seekers used vast supernatural prowess to aid Carnath. They also view the subsequent introduction of undead troops, largely championed by those beholden to the Blood of Vol, as suggestive of the dark heart of the Blood of Vol's power. It is difficult to separate bias from fact in these accounts. Whatever its power and influence, the Blood of Vol could not contain the subsequent Carnathi plague, make the army invincible, or continually supply vast amounts of food. Despite the aid the church provided Caius, some say the faithful were responsible for his remaining on the throne, the king never formally converted to the religion or issued more than the most perfunctory proclamations in its favor.
Unfortunately for Carnath, no sooner had the food shortages eased than plague struck Westhaven on Carn Bay, quickly spreading to Altur and Korth. In months, fully a third of Carnathi soldiers were either dead or incapacitated. The losses among the regular populace, who did not enjoy the same levels of food or medicine, were devastating. By the spring of 898, the Ondarian navy had managed to force the bulk of Carnath's ships north of the White Ark Bridge. That enabled a sizable force to cross over Sion Sound and begin a long-standing campaign in the north. Onder's armies overran Rechenmark and pushed far to the east, even approaching the Carn River. When word reached Sire, raids launched from the south struck deep into Carnath, again focusing on supply lines and communications. The extent of Carnath's predicament at the time was not fully understood outside the highest echelons of the nation's aristocracy. Even so, all knew starvation hovered and plague stalked the land. It is a testament to Carnathi courage and tenacity that the nation's depleted armies did not fail. In the worst of circumstances, they stood firm, exacting a price for every mile of land they gave up. Then came one of the first of the last war's many defining moments. During the spring and summer of 898, new armies arose within the catacombs of the City of Night. as necromancers and corpse collectors created the first undead legion of Autur. Rushed into position in time to face Onder's army at the Karn River crossing, the massed undead warriors turned back the assault. Although crucial in keeping Karnath's fighting capacity intact, the creation of undead soldiers was a diplomatic disaster. Those outside Karnath's borders, and even a few inside, were repulsed by the practice, particularly when it became known that the undead were being created from the bodies of Karnathi foes. These feelings deepened when more advanced undead soldiers, which became known as Karnathi skeletons and zombies, began to trickle up to the front lines. In truth, Karnath had little choice but to use the undead troops. Surrender or collapse were the only other options. In 899, Karnath navy ships, led by the blood sails of Falnan, sorted into Scion Sound and bombarded the White Ark Bridge, destroying it and cutting Onder's primary supply line. This forced the invaders to halt and regroup. It was several months before Ondarian artifice and sorcery could rebuild the link. By 900, advanced Karnathi skeletons and zombies began arriving in large numbers, 10,000 strong. They halted Onder's relentless grinding progress and prevented a siege of Korth, pushing Onder's pikes, wands, and infantry from the banks of the Karnath River. Exhausted from months of intense fighting, the Ondarian troops retreated closer to Rechenmark. The next year, Karnath suffered a second bout of the plague at home. By the turn of the century, the feared military might of Karnath was, at best, a largely stationary and defensive entity. In order to consolidate its forces and minimize supply lines, the nation essentially abandoned its power holdings south of Karlakten and east of Vulyar. Sire enjoyed the luxury of ignoring its eastern border. Although it would be decades before the country could contemplate major offensive operations, Karnathi pride and military tradition would not allow it to be completely passive. Through force of will and appeals to elite soldiers, King Caius was able to organize various small-scale sorties. Sorees? I'm not sure. For the remainder of the war, These raids ranged across the continent, from the northern coast of Onder to the Eldine reaches to the southern portions of Scion Sound to the Talenta Plains. Later in the war, as relations with Braylon deteriorated, operations began in Drome and the Braelish Heartland. The turn of the century also saw the first of a series of sharp battles between irregulars sponsored by Onder and Braylon in the southern Eldine reaches. Little more than well-armed bandits, these proxies engaged in some of the nastiest fighting of the war. Magical atrocities, guerrilla ambushes, the murder of prisoners of war, and other crimes were all alleged in this sparsely populated backwoods region. Although the events were widely reported and all knew the powers behind the fighting, both Onder and Braylon officially denied any responsibility. A few years later, an event that would turn out to be of monumental importance occurred. The elderly and well-loved Keeper Jovor Duran passed away. After an unusual delay before the flame indicated its will, a controversial choice was proclaimed. The Cardinal Caith Serain, an outspoken advocate of Thrain glory and greater church oversight, ascended. More than for his hardline stances and provocative rhetoric, Keeper Serain was an odd choice due to his age. At 31, he was far older at ascension than any other keeper in recent memory. Concerns about the direction of the Church of the Silver Flame soon quieted, however. The new keeper followed the former keeper's general politics. Lulled by the tempered proclamations, few noticed Keeper Serain steadily accelerating personal changes in the Diet of Cardinals. Thus was laid the groundwork for Thrain's darker days.
903, Second Siege of Eston. In early 903, the Thrain and Karnath navies engaged in a wide-ranging and coordinated offensive against Syrian and Ondarian shipping. Although their losses were heavy, they managed to swing control of Scion Sound to Thalen and Caius. This allowed a Thrain army to cross over to Sire and join up with a small but elite Emerald Claw strike force raiding south. Once again, ancient Eston was in harm's way. Concerned about the Thrain masses and the Karnathi knights, Siren forces outside the city did little but probe the besiegers. Thrain offered generous terms, but they were rejected, as embittered Karnath hinted at the necessity of corpse tribute to buy peace. As they had, nearly a decade before, Eston's House of Making built walls held strong. The armies settled down for a long siege. A buildup of forces and regular assaults by the attackers was nearly matched by midnight sallies of Syrian cavalry that destroyed dozens of siege towers and engines. The siege ended in 905 primarily as a result of two events. First, Karnath's yet unvanquished plague spread to Thrain, undermining that nation's means and will to fight. Second, the defenders were reinforced yet again by deadly Vorgar and his elite Ondarian rangers. The rangers arrived one day before dawn and unleashed a barrage of summonings that panicked the Thrain levies and unsettled the Karnathi elite. The Karns quickly regained their bearings, but could do little but stage a fighting retreat to cover the Thrain soldiers' lack of discipline. Vorgar's diversion of troops to relieve the siege of Eston proved costly in the north. The Ondarian forces in Karnath were unable to hold back a resurgence of Karnathi resistance, including a sustained campaign of terror and guerrilla warfare orchestrated by the Order of the Emerald Claw. Over the course of 3 months, Ondar was beaten back almost to Reckonmark. Karnath took advantage of Syare's attention at Eston to march a column of knights and military engineers, supplemented by undead soldiers southeast of Karlakton. The troops established 2 separate armed camps and began building fortifications. Fort Zombie, converted from a lightly fortified keep called Mishan's Redoubt, and Fort Bones were designed as staging points for future Karnathi operations in the area.
906 to 913. Syre embattled. In 906, over a decade after hostilities began, Breland roused itself enough to launch a major push into Syre, striking through Margul Pass and heading for Seirun and Making. The onset of winter, however, all but closed the pass with rain and snow, halting the flow of supplies to the event's elements. The invasion bogged down. Nearly all of Syre's mustered troops were fighting along the Karnathi border and guarding against Thrain invasion in the west. Breland's push added urgency to Queen Mishan's long-standing negotiations with Valis Tairn, and soon thousands of elf mercenaries came to fight for Syre. As they would at various times throughout the war, these deadly warriors harassed their enemies with stealthy guerrilla tactics. Over the next 2 years, the Braelish found their presence in Syre too costly, and they withdrew in 908.
Although it was not the only nation to contract directly with the elves, Syre held no monopoly on these elite mercenaries. Although it was the only nation to contract directly with the elves, Syre held no monopoly on these elite mercenaries. Fearing an end run around its services, House Deneth quickly stepped in and brokered arrangements between non-aligned elf warbands in several countries. Some war clans even dispensed with pay altogether, choosing to roam Corvair independently, seeking glorious battle against any foe.
In 908, Queen Mishan was assassinated by the Order of the Emerald Claw. Her son, Brust, was crowned almost immediately. The heir had already gained valuable experience leading the prince's own cavalry regiment, also called the Blues. Syre's military situation remained stable during the transition of power. Concerned about a war on 3 fronts, however, King Brust immediately began making overtures to Breland, paving the way for joint operations against Thrain several years later. Although it was a relatively minor engagement in 909, the Sky Battle of Daskaran signaled a new dimension to the war. This first aerial battle occurred between 27 Sky Knights of Ondare and 30 Wyvern Riders of Thrain. The conflict was watched from the parapets of Daskaran and fought across a vast expanse of sky. 6 Wyverns and 5 Dragonhawks plummeted to their death, and both sides claimed victory. Because the riders came from aristocrats on both sides, the battle became a symbol of the chivalry and honorable combat lost later in the war. In 910, another succession occurred. Following the quiet and mysterious death of Caius I, King Caius II took the throne of Karnath with the support of the realm's generals, wealthy landholders, and senior priests. The arrival of Caius II was a surprise to many warlords of the realm, because he was an unknown quantity. Few were aware that Caius I had even fathered an heir.
9/11, Battle of Lurching Tower. By 9/11, King Thalin's troops had been operating freely in much of Old Brayland, the area southwest of Scion Sound held by Brayland before the war. Indeed, by this time, he, rather than Queen Roan, controlled the area. Braylish objections against Thrain's occupations were brushed aside, given the exigencies of war. When Thalin claimed that Siren forces were raiding north and that he needed to secure Lurching Tower as a staging ground to combat them, Brayland hotly disputed that claim. Thrain mustered an army to strike at the Siren bandits, but in 9/11 it moved first south, not east. In the face of this crisis, King Brust's years of diplomacy bore fruit. Brayland accepted Sire's offer to help defend against the invaders. The forces of Thrain that crossed the Bray River, christened the Silver Legion, consisted of 2,000 cavalry, 6,000 regular foot, 1,000 heavy pikes, 2,000 levied irregular archers, and 16 bombardments and trebuchets. The forces was buttressed by 2 detachments of the Argent Order, an additional 2,000 troops. In all, the forces of Thrain numbered 13,000. Arriving at Lurching Tower, Thrain generally sought entry as an allied force. The Braylish commander refused to yield, and Thrain's forces declared that Siren sympathizers had corrupted the garrison. They deployed a series of assaults. The defenders fought bravely and defended their walls well. Still, few survived the 2 days it took for relief forces to arrive. Sire brought forth 3 major bodies of troops, 2,000 elf mercenaries, 1,500 dragoons, and more than 4,000 light footmen, all of which arrived by lightning rail at the Starlusker. Braylish troops amounted to 2,000 heavy horses, 500 dragoons, 1,400 light archers, and 1,200 of the Starlusker garrison, and 400 mercenary crossbowmen. They were backed by the 1st Metral Wands, an elite spellcasting unit. In total, Sire and Brayland mustered more than 14,000 troops. Although the combined Siren and Braylish army outnumbered the forces of Thrain, it suffered from having 2 co-equal commanders. Field Marshal Tara of the Syrians and General Aldi of the Braylish side. The 2 agreed on little, and the army suffered for their pride. The Braylish commander wanted to engage the enemy immediately, and pushed for a heavy cavalry charge at first light. The more casualty-conscious Field Marshal Tara preferred maneuver, taking advantage of the superior Siren and Braylish arcanists and archers. He proposed a softening up through bombardment, targeted at the Thrain frontline foot and archers. In the end, no joint plan of action was devised. At first, it didn't seem to matter. The Braylish charge threw the Thrain lines into confusion. Combined with the supporting Siren barrage, the mage-bred mounted knights achieved a breakthrough, which the infantry exploited. The battle was almost won for the Southern Kingdom when, heedless of their own lives, the soldiers of the Argent Order fought into range of the 1st Metral Wands and decimated them. The Braylish left flank began to collapse, but the discipline and quick thinking of the Siren Dragoons kept it from being a rout. Heavily mauled, both sides withdrew to their original positions before sunset. Under the cover of night, Thrain slipped the remaining 1,000 Argent Order veterans into the small Arish woods. In the morning, as forces clashed, the Argent Order struck the Siren left flank and sent it reeling. Despite heroic efforts by Field Marshal Tara, the fury of the Eberron mercenaries, and the remaining 1st Metral Wands, the flanking maneuver could not be stopped. The Braylish and Siren lack of coordination hurt as well, each commander expecting the other to throw reserves at their problem. By sunset, more than 1,600 Braylish and 650 Sirens were dead or captured. The Siren and Braylish forces retreated during the second night in good order, though their numbers had been reduced by a third. The next morning, Thrain secured Lurching Tower, threatening to expand its reach ever deeper into Brayland.
912 to 914. 912 to 914. Sieges, fortresses, and holds. After the Battle of Lurching Tower, fighting quieted for a short time. Brayland's shift to support Sire signaled a new phase for the war. Today's ally could quickly become tomorrow's foe. Intelligence and diplomatic efforts could not be ignored and had to be targeted at both ally and enemy. Sire moved next. The army, beaten back from Lurching Tower, was reinforced and, eager to avenge that loss, advanced against Arathon Keep, surrounding it in 912. Thrain's navy still ruled Sion Sound, however. It moved upriver and used its position on the Bray to destroy the Syrian camp and its supply depots. Once again, Sire was forced to withdraw. In the same summer, the first of mobile fortresses being developed in Brayland entered the fray. The massive floating structure Hydrus scored a decisive victory against Thrain in the Second Battle of Lurching Tower in that year, hoping to drive Thalin's forces north. In 913, Sire once again lost its monarch to assassination. Although no pronouncements were made this time, it was widely believed that the Order of the Emerald Claw had struck anew. King Konos ascended to the throne, but the transition did not go smoothly. Taking advantage of Sire's succession woes, Thrain levies and Carnathi knights pushed from opposite sides, converging once again on Eston. The Karns, perhaps mindful of Thrain's abandonment of the first Eston siege, felt no remorse when they were recalled mid-campaign to repel a renewed Ondarian invasion. During the confusion of the Carnathi withdrawal, arenal mercenaries surged from the fortress and won the day for Sire, driving King Thalin's armies back to Errol Dusk in full retreat. The Ondarian invasion that kept Eston in Syrian hands was a large one, supported by Sorewood supply barges, Dragonhawk scouts, and a significant number of arcane companies. Despite Caius II's recall of his armies from northern Sire to thwart this invasion, Ondarian armies gained considerable ground. In a preview of things to come, the Mror Holds declared itself a sovereign state at the First Iron Council in early 914. The clan lords correctly reasoned that no one was in a position to enforce Galafar's claim to the area, particularly not hard-pressed Karnath. Still, the dwarf lords were no fools. The Karns were their best customers for weapons, armor, and other material. Mror quickly reassured Caius II that it intended to maintain close military ties, and as a result, munitions, trade, and other business between the two areas continued. Not content with Carnathi gold, however, the Mror Holds clandestinely engaged Lazarite merchants to ship goods south to Sire and Brayland. War profiteering made all the dwarf lords extremely rich in the decades that followed.
At this point, it is instructive to address one of the most frequent questions posed by my students. How could the Five Nations have sustained their war efforts over the course of decades without collapsing? First, the war was not an entirely continuous affair. For the most part, each winter signaled a cessation of large-scale hostilities. Furthermore, the spring planting and autumn harvesting times were generally kept sacrosanct. As Karnath's early years showed in vivid detail, harvest failure could decimate a nation. Also, major military operations did not occur in all areas every year. A pause of a year or more was usually sufficient to replace casualties and lost materiel, and to restore morale. Second, the usual historical concentration on significant battles, momentous events, and war innovations concerns only a small portion of the entirety of the Five Nations. A campaign or series of battles that consumes thousands of lives is tragic and morale-sapping, but it is not a precursor to complete collapse. Population levels among the Central Nations dropped slightly during the war years, but until 994 still hovered in the area of 15 million souls. The loss of well over 1 million sirens in the events of the morning shook the other nations so severely that they agreed to cease hostilities. Still, even that horrific loss did not unravel the fabric of civilization. Finally, the last war showed that the peoples of the Five Nations are a hardy and resilient lot. The passage of centuries has not caused the children of Lazar to lose their daring, bravery, toughness, and yes, even their stubbornness. Against tremendous odds, they persevered, refusing to let personal loss, agony, or deprivation sway them. That such positive traits should be the basis for a century of bloodshed is perhaps the greatest tragedy of this time.
914 through 930. Convulsions of the Silver Flame. In 914, after a reign of nearly 30 years, King Thalin of Thrain died of old age. Even before his death, the Diet of Cardinals, now dominated by Speaker Serene and his supporters, had been vocal in its concerns about his weak son taking the throne. In eulogies and memorials after the king's death, the church first broke its silence about Thalin's vision, claiming the event was both legitimate and misunderstood. Keeper Serene himself spoke of the vision, describing the silver flame that will reach from ocean to ocean to build a kingdom of the righteous. The Keeper's confirmation of the previously unsanctified prophecy spread throughout the land like a brush fire, and the results were cataclysmic. Although everyone heard the same words of the Keeper, the vision was interpreted differently by each group. Only one thing was certain. The faith of the Silver Flame was embraced everywhere as the highest ideal of the nation. Even the church was shocked by the fervor and zealotry unleashed by the Keeper's announcement, as if the fire in the hearts of the citizenry had been quenched for too long. Far from muttering and making do, as war threatened on every border, the people of Thrain now demanded action, and they found leaders amongst the most militaristic paladins, mystics, and religious demagogues. The people revolted openly against Prince Daslin Ir Winarn, and tens of thousands barred his entry into Flamekeep for coronation at his ancestral palace. The mobs demanded that the Keeper lead them, and that the Diet of Cardinals ensure a pure life for Thrain citizenry by assuming legislative control. After stalling for a couple months to explore options, the church hierarchy accepted the people's mandate. In truth, the church appeared paralyzed by the events, and it was several years before it acted in any meaningful or coordinated way. As militant sects and orders sprang up, each strove to outdo its competitors. By 915, almost any stripe of radicalism and zealotry was accepted as normal. Calling a neighbor impious could lead to that person's death sentence. The Pure Land movement murdered foreigners in the streets. The Order of the Pure became a wandering carnival of excessive piety, and the Fire of Tribulation sect sought to cleanse speech, deed, and thought itself. Not all the cults of what came to be called the Righteous Kingdom were violent, but the more extreme militias, whether sincere or charlatans, were the ones who exerted the greatest influence. A few nobles, priests, and commoners did resist the tide, but they had no one to rally behind. The prince was meek in nature and went into private life quietly. While the cities and villages burned and riots ran rampant, Ir Winarn did nothing. By the end of 915, it was clear that the vision of a cleansing silver fire burned only within Thrain's borders. Calls to defend the young theocracy from its enemies rose in urgency and strength. Tens of thousands answered, vowing to defend Mother Church. The new rabble-rousers had only to point and tell them where to march. In the spring of 916, massed troops stood ready, rising each morning to sing in joyous prayer. Casting about for the worst of the unbelievers, the mobs focused on the Onder-occupied West. Their fervor unmatched, the newly expanded Silver Legion and the newly created Pure Legion formed a peasant army thousands strong. The first military engagement of the new Thrain was to be at the Battle of the Silver Banners. In the end, religious zeal and commanders known for little but fiery oratory could not stand against veteran soldiers and competent generals. In a series of sharp, clever flanking fights, a smaller Ondarian force routed the Thrains. Captured banners were hung upside down in the Ondarian capital and subjected to considerable mockery. The legions retreated to Morning Crest, bloodied. but unbound. Over the next fall and winter, the mass denunciations against internal enemies slowed as the Keeper and the Diet of Cardinals finally began to reassert some semblance of control over the population. For the first time, the Keeper seemed to be truly embracing the power forced upon him. A growing number of members of the Council of Cardinals, including the now majority hardliners in the Diet, publicly supported the tenor, if not the means, of the mob fervor. By late summer 917, ominous statements about Breland began circulating among the powerful in Flame Keep. The most volatile religious leaders considered all the nations around Thrain to be faithless, but Breland was deemed particularly blasphemous. That nation's disloyalty in siding with Sire against Thrain before the Battle of Lurching Tower showed the Braelish lack of character. The people of Thrain's steadfast tolerance of different faiths and viewpoints blinded them to the one truth of Thalin's vision and Keeper's leadership. Early in the winter, Breland formally complained that Thrain's conscript navy impinged on personal liberties, that the forced conversions in the borderlands around Sigilstar failed to respect private faith and belief, and that mandatory tithing in the Lessic area of Old Breland violated Braelish law. The Diet of Cardinals denounced Braelish interference in Thrain's internal affairs, and strenuously objected when a group of overzealous Pure Land missionaries was turned away at the Braelish border. In 918, a spontaneous and enthusiastic Southern Crusade milled about in the lands of Old Breland, ridding the land of Braelish sympathizers, and fully securing it as part of Thrain. Still, Breland refused to be drawn in. With little direction and even less meaningful leadership, the peasant army ran out of steam and wandered home for the harvest. No pitched battle occurred, but the Keeper and the Diet did learn valuable lessons about controlling and directing mob armies. In that same year, saboteurs destroyed the glass tower of Shan. Breland suspected Thrain or Ondarian involvement. Thrain blamed Sire and Carnath provocateurs. With spying and conspiracies so rampant, each week brought new rumors about the responsible parties. The anger of the Breelish people could find no specific outlet, and the government of ailing Queen Rowan could not muster the necessary focus to identify one. As a result, no major offensive was launched in response. The primary impact of the tragedy was a reinforcement of Breelish suspicions and isolation.
The upheaval in Thrain caused a profound rift in the national branches of the Church of the Silver Flame. Although the church was never overly popular in Carnath, worshippers could be found in large numbers in Breland, Sire, and Ondare. Cardinals outside Thrain, mindful of the nationalistic bent to the new fervour and seemingly abandoned by the Keeper and the Diet, rushed to proclaim their home loyalty and decry the upheaval. Suddenly suspect Silver Flame followers throughout Corvair worked diligently to separate themselves from the events in Thrain. Braelish tolerance and Siren appreciation for spiritual matters allowed most of the church faithful to avoid persecution, as long as they left no doubt as to their nationalism. The fallout was far worse in Ondare, where King Rogar ordered Fairhaven's Cathedral of the Silver Flame closed.
919. Battle of Bray River. In early 919, Keeper Serain spoke to the enraptured crowd in Flamekeep. His vague exhortations concerning a flame sweeping across nations were, once again, not widely divergent from long-standing Silver Flame dogma. In the context of the Righteous Kingdom, however, they were more than enough to inspire a fresh crusade. By the time it arrived at the Bray River in midsummer, the Pure Legion was more mob than army, but its numbers were daunting. Roughly 29,000 levies and peasant volunteers, Many of them child soldiers, were supported by 3,000 Thrain regulars, 4,000 militant priests of the Argent Order, 3,000 regular archers, and 1,000 light cavalry. They were met at the lower ford of the Bray River within a day's march of Vathenrod, not by the city's nominative owner Brayland, but by a force of roughly 12,000 well-prepared Siren troops. Sire fielded 3,000 veteran archers, 1,500 noble cavalry, 2,500 levy lightfoot, 2,000 regulars, 2,200 Valinar foot mercenaries, and 800 battlecasters from the 1st and 2nd Metral Wands. At first, the trained and professional Siren troops made the river crossing a slaughter for the green levies of Thrain. They held the ford on the first day of the battle and during the night. At that point, an army of Braylish arrived in the west. Wary of each other, the forces arrayed, the masked Silver Flame faithful as well as the Siren enemies from the Margul Pass. The Braylish troops took up defensive positions. They sent riders to each side, informing them that their orders were to keep the combatants from moving towards the Braylish heartland. This inactivity sat poorly with Brayland's hired goblin marauders, but the battle's second bloody day passed without movement by Brayland. Thrain's troops continued to suffer significant losses, but their assaults wore its Siren numbers and morale. Were it not for the ferocious elves who appeared to move about the battlefield unhindered, the Siren position would have been far worse at day's end. Thrain and Sire clashed again on the third day, but by this time the Braylish goblins had had enough. They broke ranks and rushed the nearest combatant. As it turned out, they slammed into the Siren left flank. Assuming that Brayland had finally decided to back Thrain, the Siren army's strained morale failed, and it fled east. In 3 days, thousands died. Bodies washed downstream for miles, with fishermen in Scion Sound and Eston catching corpses in their nets, days and even weeks later. The Battle of Bray River was easily the bloodiest battle of the first 30 years of the war. With the withdrawals of its enemies, the new bloodthirsty Pure Legion turned east. The mob looted and pillaged Western Sire for 2 weeks before being driven back to Vathenrod by the arrival of the Siren heavy cavalry and heavy foot. Although tempted to strike north and free their prior territories beyond Castle Roanwatch, the Braylish forces received no new orders and thus pulled back to more defensible positions near Lurching Tower. Towards the end of 919, Queen Roan finally succumbed to old age. Her reign had been long and prosperous, but now King Cassin ascended to the throne. The new king echoed the sentiments of many when he cautioned against too great involvement in foreign entanglements. In 1920, a Thrain army, now fully backed by the church, moved against Aundair in the grasslands east of Galt. The Aundair troops, supported by the country's guardian towers, were too skilled and too entrenched. The Thrain made little headway. For Aundair, a draw was as good as a victory. It continued to hold the land that Thrain once proclaimed as its own. That same year, indomitable King Rogar of Aundair died while hunting in the Eldane Reaches. Foul play was suspected but never proven, and he was succeeded the following year by his daughter, Queen Rella. Although the transition was smooth, Aundair had lost a furious warrior, a brilliant commander, and one of its only monarchs who cultivated deep and personal ties in the Reaches. Aundair irregulars were used southeast of the Blackcaps and pushed towards the small Thrain garrison in Airless Car. Thrain's troops at Drum Keep were besieged in 922. Aundair did not have the resources or troop strength to take the stronghold, and Thrain could do little more than bring in limited amounts of supplies through the mountainous terrain. As a result, the stalemate position remained for 14 years. Displaying its usual complacency, the only reaction of Brayland to hostilities along its northern border was to hire auxiliaries to harass both sides.
922. Death of Royals. In 922, King Rella of Aundair's betrothal and marriage to Dagon of Sire, younger brother to King Konos, was announced to great acclaim in both lands. A year later, she gave birth to an heir. These glad tidings soon turned tragic. The Queen's floating coach was surprised by a flight of Thrain wyvern riders ranging deep into Aundair. The Thrain force suffered heavy casualties, but scattered the escort Dragonhawks and assaulted the royal procession. Both Queen Rella and Dagon of Sire perished. Since the newborn crown prince Eberron was too young to rule, Lord Marlex was proclaimed regent. Even darker circumstances claimed the life of Braelin's monarch. Anxious to avoid further commitment of Braelish troops, King Cason stepped up previously tentative efforts to bring a demon regiment from the plain of Shavarath to fight on his behalf. During one particularly intense negotiation session with a Merilith, the demon broke free and consumed the king and 3 of his closest advisors before returning to her home plain. 5 months later, in late 922, Regent Brask was finally able to consolidate power. He then released details of the former king's folly, intended to quash the few remaining internal calls for outside help, and as a warning against any other realms that might be thinking along the same lines. The announcement extinguished any possibility of reconciliation between Braeland and Thrain. Accusations of diabolism and prophecies of Braelish doom spilled from the Keeper and the Cardinals in a steady flow. In 923, the Thrain denunciations against Braeland reached a fever pitch. The Pure Legion and the Legion of Perpetual Adoration gathered in southwestern Thrain and marched south. The Braelish Rangers spotted them early, and the regent gathered the great army of Rote to oppose the invasion. The Battle of the Green Haunt, as it was later known, was fought in the forest between Cragwar and Sword Keep, with enormous numbers of dead, mostly Thrain levies, being left unburied among the trees. Still, it was less Thrain's superior numbers than Braelish hesitancy and lack of commitment that carried the day. Even decades into the war, Braeland proved it was not willing to sustain an all-out war effort or suffer large numbers of casualties. Emboldened by their victory in the Battle of the Green Haunt, the Thrain legions turned against Braeland with full force in high summer, almost cutting the country in half. In desperation, Regent Brask convinced the gnomes to march north and contracted with House Deneath for greater numbers of goblin mercenaries to support them. The looming Thrain threat brought about a first full-scale stirring of the Sleeping Bear. New volunteers and fresh material began flooding north. The fresh resolve blunted Thrain's southern movement. The Braelish rallied and advanced from Rote in the west and Starlasker in the east. Threatened with encirclement, the Thrains pulled back and set up defensive formations north of Hatheril. In 924 and 925, the fighting faltered as all of the combatants paused to regroup. Raids against neighbors were minimal, and no major invasions of territory were launched. Then, harvests failed in Braeland and Sire, and their armies turned to seizing food supplies. Thrain rejoiced, and the Keeper hinted that a divine hand was acting against her enemies. But the harvests were poor elsewhere as well. Too few hands worked the fields, and too many raids had burned farmsteads. After almost 30 years of war, banditry ran rampant in most of Old Galifar.
(925 to 930). Anguish in occupied Thaliost. Onder's regent Marlex, securely in power now, concocted a bold scheme in late 925. Troops would be stripped from the static Carnathi campaign, including garrisons over the key supply line across Sion's Sound, in order to reinforce the 2 towers operating in western Thrain. A major push in the area of Galt would cut off the southern half of Thrain and force the church to sue for peace, even if the operation was not a major success. Thrain forces would be pushed that much further from Fairhaven and would be unable to conduct serious operations elsewhere. Unfortunately for Onder, a deep-cover devotee of the Flame was embedded in its command staff. At great personal risk, he leaked the plans to his priest, who passed them along to his superiors. Taking advantage of their superior intelligence, the Cardinals gathered another army of faithful, this time at Flamekeep. When Aundair stepped up raids in the Lathlier region in early 926, the Cardinals exercised a previously unknown level of control over their mob armies by sending advance elements west as misdirection. Suddenly, the commanders gave a surprise order, and the newly proclaimed Northern Crusade wheeled and arrived in Daskaran before word could spread. Aundair was caught in mid-plan. The bulk of its reserve forces were in western Thrain. The Northern Crusade surged across the Aundair River and quickly seized ancient Thaliost. Aundair's skeleton army in the east fought courageously, but was simply overwhelmed. Conducting swift and thorough operations that had obviously been planned previously, Thrain soldiers stormed into the homes of Thaliost's most prominent citizens. Those citizens were given a choice: swear loyalty to Thrain, or die. Given their renowned pragmatic nature, many capitulated. Still, more than a few of the city's elite were steadfast in their loyalty to Aundair, and thus were put to the sword. In very short order, Thrain seized control of the city's government. The conquering army's leaders, perhaps too focused on securing Thrain rule, turned a blind eye when fanatic soldiers engaged in widespread sword point conversions. The response in Aundair was bitter. When rumors spread that a Silver Flame spy had betrayed the country, citizens sacked Silver Flame temples and facilities, and even lynched the High Priest in Fairhaven. The remaining Silver Flame adherents in Aundair renounced their faith, abandoning overt trappings of their worship, proclaimed their loyalty, or denounced the councils of cardinals. In sum, did whatever was necessary to survive the purge. These crimes and reactions enraged Thrain's leaders and soldiers. In the spiraling retaliation, Thrain did not lose sight of its military position. The army entrenched in depth along the new border with Aundair, guarding all land approaches to Thaliost. Aundair was forced to conduct risky crossings of Sion's Sound to bring supplies to its forces that remained entrenched in Karnath. Aundair poured its rage into its originally planned assault, striking east from Galt. The Thrain forces slowed the Aundarian advance and even repelled an opportunistic Braelish raid near Cragwar. At midsummer, Aundair and Thrain met for a second battle at the Crying Fields. This time, the forces of Aundair decisively defeated the outnumbered Thrain troops and seized significant territory. The Thrain armies withdrew. Despite these setbacks, Thrain retained and tightened its grip on conquered Thaliost and the surrounding lands. Members of the Northern Crusade seized houses and property abandoned by Thaliost refugees or those, quote, cleansed by sword. The ancient royal palace was remade into Cardinal Sudro's home after he was appointed governor of Thrain's newest province. The Aundarians did not give up. In 927, the Grand Army of Liberation marched into the Silverwood and surged toward Thaliost. This was Aundair's most desperate attempt to retake its pre-Galifar capital, but despite the work of Sky Knights, the Knights Arcane, and their Knight Phantoms, the Fairhaven and Stormhome Wands, and other elite units, it failed. The army was stopped, and then pushed back that autumn by the tenacity of Thrain's soldiers. Unlike Thrain, Aundair lacked the numbers to fight a two-front war, both in Thaliost and near Galt. In the end, the Aundarians were forced into a harsh retreat toward Kirkulin, beginning what came to be known as the Shameful March. Humbled by the Thrains, the Aundarians looted food and livestock as they left, robbing from fellow Aundarians to deny aid to the enemy. The depleted Grand Army of Liberation set up defensive positions along the northern coast with heavy hearts. In high summer of 928, emboldened by Aundair's action the prior year and led to believe that magical support might arrive to strengthen their hand, the commoners of Thaliost revolted. The soldiers of Thrain moved to suppress the revolt, but the Diet of Cardinals demanded softer methods be applied first. They decreed that no food would be supplied to the city until the rebels surrendered. The cardinals misjudged the commoners, who found ways to smuggle food and supplies into the city and resisted the siege. When the gentler hand failed, the Diet unleashed the knights. The city was pacified, show trials were held, and the captured instigators were burned alive as an example. Thrain Thalios' attitudes, unpleasant previously, became even more bitter. A large garrison called the Flames Anointed was assigned to the city from 928 forward, and relations between the city's people and its occupiers remained tainted even years after the war's end.
Thrain's actions in Thalios mark the darkest point in Keeper Serain's reign. It cannot be questioned that the Church of the Silver Flame was in complete control of the Northern Crusade, and that all the measures taken to pacify Thalios were approved by the Diet of Cardinals. Although the lycanthropic crusade has long been a warning of the potential of Silver Flame excesses, Thalios is truly the most evil of church-sponsored activities. Given the fervor of the nation at the time, it could be argued that the church rulers had little choice when faced with intractable opposition, but that is a circular claim. After all, the mood of Thrain was in no small part a product of the Keeper's and the Cardinal's exhortations. Some have described the Keeper as a weak individual overwhelmed by the passions of his time. Others point to his pre-ascension writings and deem all Thrain's actions to be part of his long-term plans. Certain Silver Flame commentators have suggested that the long-denied shadow in the flame was responsible. Whatever the cause of this tragic chapter of history, many of the Church of the Silver Flame have spent the last 3/4 of a century seeking redemption. Given all the good the Church has created and all the true evil it has vanquished over the years, we can only hope that the young Keeper Daran continues the virtuous path she has laid before the faithful.
Also in 928, saboteurs used powerful magical fire to destroy the White Arch Bridge, severing the lightning rail link between Thalios and Rechenmark. No concrete evidence has been unearthed proving whether the attack was motivated by Thrain trying to secure Thalios from Aundair forces to the east, by Aundair fearful of further Thrain advances, or even by Karnath seeking to isolate Aundair forces in its territory. Regardless, neither of the three countries had sufficient magical resources or control of the surrounding region to implement reconstruction. From that day forward, the bridge remained a ruin. That same year, Ven Ir-Keslan led 4,000 settlers on an arduous voyage along the coast to the southeastern Corvair to birth the nation of Kabara. Many died of disease, hunger, and pirate attack during the journey and in settling the jungle. But the small nation stabilized and became a beacon for those fleeing what the Kabarans called the Western War. As the war continued to rage, the people of Kabara took no real notice of political or military changes west of the mountains. For them, it was all the civil war in central Galifar. Even after the war, their language and attitudes remained stuck in an older time, even as their culture and towns grew to resemble those of Valinar humans and the Lazar principalities, their primary trading partners.
Many question King Connis's approval of Ir-Keslan's mission and his grant of the Kabaran lands. Why would Sire, pressed by decades of war, allow thousands to abandon it? First, the majority of the settlers were steadfast objectors to the war, believing that no Galifaran should raise arms against another. They were more a burden on Sire than a boon. Still, the king could have forced their support. Second, the land grant involved territories that until recently had been claimed by Karnath. No doubt, Konos hoped to distract and insult his northern foe. Most important, in my view, however, Konos was a true child of Sire, and thus Siren appreciation was his lifeblood. Ir-Keslan was an accomplished diplomat, and he appealed to the poetry in His Majesty's soul. King Konos was touched by Erkeslin's vision and could not deny his request, despite its complete lack of strategic benefit for Sire. Although the final chapter of the New Galifar project in the jungles of Kabara has yet to be written, its beginning was a hope-dappled marriage of brilliant negotiation and a war-weary heart.
Finally, the eventful year of 928 brought a new royal to power in Breland. King Boronex was crowned that year, although he had effectively assumed power from Regent Brask when he came of age in 927. His first full year of power would begin in massacre. In 929, the Silver Legion of Thrain, an outfit known for its toughness and grit, stepped up its efforts to secure the lands between Lake Bray and the Black Caps. Ranging south to Hatheril, one company encountered stiff resistance. Claiming to follow the doctrine of Thaliost, the soldiers massacred half the inhabitants as unbelievers and forced mass conversion on the survivors. Outrage ran the length of Breland and beyond. Once again, the worst stereotypes of the Silver Flame fanatics were confirmed. Citing this event, the gnomes of Zilargo moved even closer to their western neighbor, sending permanent detachments to train with Brelish wands and scouts. The mounting atrocities compelled a group of Thrain's cardinals to warn against excesses of zealotry. It seemed that not all of Thrain's priesthood agreed with the Keepers and the Diet's approach. Recriminations began to fly in Flamecleep as hardliners railed against those who would subvert Thrain's holy cause. Keeper Serene ceased making public appearances, and rumors flew that he was ailing. He would be seen little during the remaining years of his reign. Although the path would not be smooth or swift, these tidings are the first evidence that the Church's elders were stepping away from the abyss. The Diet issued Breland a formal apology. It even cast from the Church and imprisoned the officer priests of the Silver Legion Company that destroyed Hatheril. They were reinstated to command when passions ran high once again. The cardinals then sent a delegation to Roet to offer a cessation of hostilities. In 930, a ceasefire was signed between Thrain and Breland. Thrain voluntarily pulled back north of the Cragwar and Sword Keep, and Breland assumed control of a border anchored by those strongholds. For Thrain, this retreat allowed the Church to concentrate on quashing any hint of civil war, and to focus attention on its many other enemies.
928 through 936. Sire in the balance. Given the assassination of his grandmother and his father by the Emerald Claw, King Konos' hatred of Karrnath was absolute. Siren forces had pushed the Karrnathi troops north and east, away from the border, but those hostilities were far from over. Given Breland's ceasefire with Thrain, Sire became concerned that the Cardinals would move east. Finally, although Sire had a working relationship with Breland, the events of recent years showed that no alliance was truly solid. King Konos decided that it was time to go on the offensive.
(929) Battle of Metrol. In 929, King Konos gathered an army of cavalry regiments and deadly Valinar mounted scouts in the area south of Lake Sire. They were ordered to strike the previously Karrnathi-held regions of Talenta, annexing the lands and establishing a trade route through to the Moorholds, the Principalities, and Kabara. Ultimately, the first battle of the plains of Talentia was lost through a combination of Syrian overconfidence and Halfling unity. The Syrians expected to take the tribes apart one by one, but instead they found themselves facing an army as large as their own and with better knowledge of the terrain. The Halflings and their dinosaurs beat back the cavalry. Emerald Claw spies made sure that news of Sire's failed Talentia campaign soon reached the court in Korth. Sire's armies in the northern lines were stretched thin, and many troops had been taken out of the Metrol garrison to support Konos' strike east. The next year, Karrnath was in perfect position to take advantage of Sire's setback. Onder's eastern army had been quiet since its main supply line over the White Arch Bridge had been cut. King Caius II's years of rebuilding and marshalling forces bore fruit. He gathered a powerful army at Vedekar and moved it quickly by lightning rail south of Fort Zombie. The troops were ably commanded by General Crone, Caius's distant cousin, who had previously been lauded for his masterful use of undead, the terrain, and defensive tactics during the Ondarian invasion. Crone was eager for a chance to display his offensive command skills. The order of battle included 2,000 dragoons, 1,500 heavy cavalry, 2,500 irregular archers from the Carnwood, 4,000 crossbowmen, 13,000 light foot, 4,000 pike, and 12,000 undead, including the 1st and 2nd Auteur legions. Most important, though, were 2 mercenary engineering regiments from the Mror holds, who came equipped with bombards, towers, and trebuchets. All told, more than 39,000 troops set out from eastern Karrnath, the largest army the country had ever assembled. Lord Crone's expedition, as it came to be known, quick-marched the miles south and west to threaten Metrol. In a masterful stroke, Crone had the dwarf engineers fashion a group of large rafts, which the regiments used to cross Lake Sire at several points along the way, enabling multiple prongs of attack against Sire. One detachment was ordered south to intercept any reinforcements. Given the lack of Karrnathi military activity in the east, Sire had not concentrated its defenses in the area, so quick and secret was Karrnath's advance that the home guard of Sire, 5,000 of the nation's best heavy infantry, supported by 1,000 engineers and artillerists, had only a couple days to prepare. In that time, the nobles and gentry of Sire quickly raised 2,000 light horse and a levy force of 8,000 Metrol citizens. The defenders were determined to hold their country's capital. A last-minute arrival by lightning rail of 4,000 troops from the west, including a few hard-bitten veterans of the Eston sieges, bolstered the city's morale as the smoke from Karrnathi pillage began to appear on the horizon. Despite all this, the Karrnathi had far greater numbers, and half the Syrian army was raw recruits untested in battle. Despite the bravery of the troops, the citizenry succumbed to panic and chaos reigned. Refugees poured out, heading west and south. Shaken by the populace's reaction, the Syrian forces decided not to wait for a siege. The home guard marched out and took position outside the city walls on a low hill covered by archers and with levies to either side. The cavalry was held in reserve. Crone's strategy was to encircle and destroy the Syrian position, and he did this by forming most of his columns into 2 wings. The token force left to hold the center against the home guard did a brilliant job of keeping it occupied. Indeed, the Eston troops drove into Crone's forces on the center left, and Syrian General Duran Forgil prepared the light horse to exploit what he was sure was a coming breakthrough. Suddenly, the Karn plan unfolded. Dragoons and heavy cavalry, all hardened veterans, appeared on the flanks, slicing into the levies. The western troops in the center were abruptly forced into a fighting retreat as the supporting troops on their flank evaporated. Only the home guard held its position, and in the end all 5,000 were either cut down or captured in the dying light of the afternoon. No serious resistance remained to stop Lord Crone's troops. One quick blast from the Mror bombards at close range destroyed the city gatehouse, and the victorious warriors poured in. The Karns had borne decades of famine, disease, and ignominious defense operations. It was time to show the world that Karrnath must be feared. All night, all the next day, and for 3 more days after that, Metrol was an open city. The screaming never stopped. While Metrol was put to fire and sword, corpse collectors performed their gruesome rounds, and a new Auteur legion rose. After 5 days of looting and killing, Lord Crone rallied his forces for a triumphant march back to the Karrnathi heartland. Certainly, little was left of Metrol to occupy. The victorious Karns burned and pillaged their way along the western back of the Sire River, leaving a charred path 300 miles long. In the fall, Caius II offered harsh terms to Konos, which would have ceded land to Karnath, renounced the Syrian claim to the crown of Galifar, and imposed yearly tribute. Sire rejected the offer and began a propaganda campaign decrying the martyrdom of Metrol and the rape of Sire and the presence of cannibalistic undead in the streets during the sack.
Although a dismal time for the Sire military, the aftermath of the sack of Metrol was a triumph for Siren diplomacy. Sire played the wronged victim to the hilt. Liaisons with Breland, Thrain, Aundair, and even the Siren cities to the south and west presented graphic accounts of the Karn's depredations, particularly their corpse harvesting. Their performances were masterful and rallied the world to Sire's side. Karnathi atrocities during the sack of Metrol, while tragic, might have actually saved Sire from annihilation. Those acts fully united all of Sire against Karnath and gained it great sympathy from the other nations.
930 to 935. Reaction to the sack of Metrol. After the slaughter at Metrol, King Borinex severed ties between Breland and Karnath. In response, Caius II ordered a series of raids against far western Baelish outposts. Thrain's Diet of Cardinals, whose proclamations concerning its longtime ally had been muted to this point, condemned Caius II and announced that Thrain would no longer support its northeastern neighbor. The church made it known through back channels that no Silver Flame force would oppose a Siren retaliation or Aundarian offensive. Confident it would not be distracted by the other nations, and entirely committed to Karnath's defeat, Sire marshaled naval and land forces for a fresh campaign in the north. Meanwhile, in Karnath, the afterglow of the triumph at Metrol quickly turned sour. The victory had muted news of another disastrous harvest, and again starvation stalked the land. Even worse, Lord Cron let his triumph and subsequent promotion to Field Marshal of the armies go to his head. He began ordering troop movements without consulting the king, and used strong-arm tactics to ensure that he and his soldiers were well fed during the winter. His ultimate undoing occurred when he tired of the arrogance of the Order of the Emerald Claw and barred the order from his presence. When the Order presented King Caius II with eyewitness accounts of Cron's plans to declare himself monarch, Caius was saddened, but not surprised. The declaration of Cron's treachery and his assassination, along with that of his senior staff, shortly thereafter devastated the army and significantly weakened Karnathi war efforts. For their part, the Sirens chose to ignore the pillaged lands in the east. An advance there would lead only to the nigh impregnable bastion at Carlacton. The Avengers pushed north across Sion's Sound farther west, an area from which it had been launching raids for years. King Konos led the Siren assault personally, and the troops fought with avenging fury. The Karns were about to stage a delaying action against the Siren advance at Loren Rath, but could do little but fall back slowly. By the end of summer, Sire had secured a solid foothold on Karnathi soil north of the Sound.
House Deneth's role in the last war has been widely discussed. Given the demand for mercenary services, its fortunes soared. Less reported is its role in securing Carlacton from the ravages of war. Mindful of House Cainith's troubles in Eston, Deneth issued an early proclamation that it would secure and preserve its home city. Glad to have Deneth guarding its largest city and anchoring the southeastern reaches of Sion's Sound, Karnath initially supported the decision. Only later, when Caius II realized that Deneth truly meant to keep Carlacton free from any nation's war effort, did he regret his father's inaction. Still, the king wisely chose not to precipitate a possible civil war by attempting to occupy and control the city. No one wished to anger the continent's primary supplier of mercenary troops, or challenge the stout defenses of the Sentinel House's home.
Taking advantage of Karnath's distractions with internal politics and the avenging Siren force, Ondarian troops stepped up operations east of Rechenmark. Though these conflicts were mostly large-scale raids aimed at supplementing the trickle of supplies crossing Sion's Sound, they tied down Karnathi troops that could have reinforced the south. With the Karnathi pressed on two sides and internally divided, their toughness once again came to the fore. By slowly falling back and extracting a bloody price for every mile, the Karns caused both fronts to bog down significantly. Their commanders knew that, in time, Siren passion would cool and the Ondarian supplies would run out. By mid-autumn, the fronts stopped moving, and all sides settled in for the harsh Karnathi winter. All knew this was a temporary truce, and immediately began refitting their armies and rebuilding their fortifications. Even so, the informal ceasefire would last nearly 5 years. By 934, Caius had carefully purged his army of Krone supporters, and once again had begun thinking long-term. Although the Ondarian and Siren presence in his lands was galling, those forces had shown no inclination to move forward. He needed to finally secure his eastern lands. Heavily supported by undead troops and marching largely by night, the Eastern Star Legion met and defeated a semi-united force of halflings in the Second Battle of the Plains of Talenta. Karnath took a number of valuable chieftains hostage, and in this way secured the good behavior of the northern Talenta tribes. It was a policy that Karnath continued throughout the war. Ondar and Thrain, meanwhile, engaged in pitched battles from the Star Peaks to the Crying Fields. Neither of the two mortal enemies could claim victory when the low-intensity siege of Drum Keep was lifted. King Boronex ordered the newly completed fortress Argonth north to secure the Blackcaps. Uncertain whom he meant to battle, and unwilling to face a flying bastion, both Ondar and Thrain retreated. Although the cardinals objected, in truth, Thrain's position in the far west had been untenable since the Crag War had been lost. Ondar reassigned its few advisors north and left the area, almost completely, in the hands of hastily commissioned bandit auxiliaries.
936. First Siege of Korth. Along the relatively stable battle lines in the north, 936 saw a large-scale Siren raid into Karnath. The timing was good because the invasion happened while Karnath's reserves were pushing back Ondar in the north and mopping up the remaining outposts of tribal resistance in the Talenta Plains. The Siren raiders discovered a vulnerable point in the Karnathi lines and surged through. They encountered little resistance and urgently requested more troops and supplies. Acting nimbly, Sire's General Buragoff, Supreme Commander of the Northern Front, rushed to exploit the breakthrough. Although the fighting was pitched at times, Karnathi troops defended bravely. Sire was able to make significant progress towards Korth. Hoping to avoid an extended siege, Sire immediately assaulted the walls. This attack might have been successful if the plot opened to the south gate, leading straight into the king's palace, had not been uncovered and stymied by the Order of the Emerald Claw. While Korth's heavy troops included a detachment of Conqueror's host, the king's personal guards pushed the invaders back. Priests of Vol magically barred the gates. Thereafter, General Brugoff contented himself with pillaging the countryside for miles in all directions. Marines from the privateering town of Westhaven staged a daring voyage down Sion Sound to harry Siren supply lines. Karnathi relief forces returning from Talenta and those raised from levies in the countryside contended the besiegers, denying them food from foraging. Finally, King Caius II stepped out from Kron's besmirched shadow and showed himself to be a powerful military leader, rallying the common folk and personally leading undead legions on the night raids against Siren lines. In the end, Sire retreated back towards the Sound. Though the siege was lifted, Siren forces continued to hold parts of southern Karnath until late 940. Karnath's villages suffered heavily in this period, and dark mutterings about the alliance of Aundair, Sire, and Thrain were common in Korth for a time. In fact, Thrain never actively aided Aundair and Sire, but by failing to relieve the Karns in any way, it became a target of popular wrath. Towards the end of 936, Thrain lost its controversial ruler after a lingering ailment during which the keeper reportedly aged prematurely. Caith Sarain died. In a relatively brief but extraordinarily momentous reign, the keeper gave full voice to Thrain's territorial ambitions, wrapping them in the mantle of religious mandate. In a last oddity, like so many characterized in his rule, it was months before the Flames spoke about ascension. Not until mid-937 was Keeper Lavaria Tagor proclaimed.
From a long-term viewpoint, Keeper Tagor's appointment was one of the most important events of the early Middle War years. The new keeper fully supported the long-standing church doctrine of spreading the flame. She also made certain that she curried favor among the nation's hardliners, who so dominated the ruling circles. Still, her approach and dictates were significantly more moderate than Sarain's. Keeper Tagor began to emphasize core values, using military might to do good, not just win battles. For example, it was during her reign that the church officially abandoned its stance that shifters and changelings were the spawn of evil. No doubt mindful of the world's legitimate grievances against Thrain and the dire circumstances of the purified in other nations, Keeper Tagor began to stress redemption and repentance. In the end, however, Thrain was surrounded by enemies and ruled by the most militant of the clergy. Widespread internal debate, investigation, or condemnation would have been suicidal. A weakening of the military or any retreat from religious fervor would have caused revolt. Keeper Tagor conducted a long and slow battle against extremism, primarily by countering her predecessor's rigid appointments with much more thoughtful and balanced priests. Her battle for the soul of the church was often a lonely one. In her later years, a formidable proponent of Thrain domination arose in the form of High Cardinal Crozin. Given the forces arrayed against her and the monumental task of returning the silver flame to the good graces of the world, Keeper Tagor might have been the greatest of the silver flame prelates.
937. First battlefield constructs. Although crude golems designed by House Cannith and labeled Warforged had served in limited numbers in royal guards throughout Corvair since before the war, the first extensive use of constructs in war came in the late 930s. Using designs created in conjunction with a college of wizards who referred to themselves as Silver Pyromancers, House Cannith pushed forward with a project first proposed decades ago by King Thalen, a mechanical horse. In 937, the dragon-marked house began large-scale manufacturing. Late the next year, the constructs were numerous enough that the Knights of Thrain could conduct the famous clockwork charge on the backs of perfectly obedient mechanical steeds. The larger conflict, the Battle of Marsden Field, is not especially memorable. Thrain held the field against a small Syrian army that landed by sea near Aureldusk. The charge, however, was remarkable. The riders' attack order held perfect shape against the veteran pikemen of Sire. The cavalry commanders of Thrain asked for more such steeds, but the nobles and riding priests disdained them as contrivances and unnatural to the way of war. Thrain had other interests than lining the pockets of House Cannith. Sire, on the other hand, quickly grasped the value of clockwork steeds. The nation's close ties with House Cannith and a massive investment by the crown ensured that significant numbers of Sire cavalry would soon benefit from these wondrous constructs. More important, a seed had been planted among the artificers and smiths of House Cannith. Years of experimentation followed, and enormous sums were consumed in search to create even more wondrous mechanical warriors.
939 to 946. Reprisals and revisions. Over time, the flashpoints of combat grew familiar. The Crying Fields, Cragwar, Eston, Vatherond, and Korth were all venues for repeated engagements. In the north, Aundair and Thrain traded quite a bit of territory, while Karnath mostly engaged with Sire. In the south, Greyland, Sire, and Thrain often shifted alliances.
939. Second Siege of Korth. Emboldened by Sire's continuing occupation of southern Karnath and Caius' focus tied up there, Aundair launched a massive raid. Surprised by the lack of initial resistance, advanced units actually reached sight of the walls of Korth and set up camp. Both sides prepared for a siege, but it was more anticipation than action. Aundair's supply lines remained too tenuous to support extended offensive operations so deep in Karnath. The two sides settled into a relatively peaceful siege during the winter of 939, but once the weather cleared and Karnathi forces began gathering in 940, Aundair withdrew. The citizens of Korth refer to this time as the Short Siege. A second reason for Aundair's retreat was an uneasy succession. Crown Prince Erot reached the age of maturity, and he and his supporters began to prepare for his coronation. Regent Marlex initially balked at losing the reins of power. Quite a bit of machinations accompanied the removal of the regent in 940, and King Erot's crowning the next year. To this day, the Aundair monarchy has not forgotten the role intrigue played in securing its power.
942. Third Battle of the Plains of Talentia. In a combat freed from the nearly immobile battle lines along Sion's Sound, Syrian and Karnathi forces clashed in the plains of Talentia. The site of the battle was 100 miles southeast of Vulyar. 900 Syrian heavy cavalry rode clockwork steeds, and the Oak and Ash Regiment added 400 heavy foot. King Konos' forces also featured a superior arcane might from 2 companies of the First Metral Wands, including a young Shaldra Ontariel, later a famous traitor, as well as 3,500 mercenary elf archer/skirmishers, and the 2,000 light cavalry of the Kalazar Horse Brigade. In addition, the Making First Legion, the Making Fourth Legion, and the Seirin Pike were all present, adding 7,000 infantry to an army totaling roughly 15,000. The Karnathi forces were more numerous, including the 1st and 2nd Otter Legion, 3,000 skeletons and 3,000 zombies, 4,000 displaced Reckonmark crossbows, 2,000 of them undead, and 8,500 soldiers of the Korth and Bedekar heavy infantry. The heavy cavalry numbered 1,800, including Bone Knight regiments from the Order of the Onyx Skull and the Order of the Emerald Claw, as well as an undead heavy cavalry force, the City of the Night Regiment. In total, Karnath brought more than 20,000 units to the battle. Its most valuable force was a group of Talentia halfling scouts who called themselves the Thunder Riders. Sire knew that its infantry, even with excellent wand and archer support, could not withstand the shock troops of the heavily armored Karnathi Bone Knight cavalry. King Konos' troops chose their ground, dug a magically disguised trench, and made clever use of illusions to draw their opponents out. In the morning, the plan went, the Karnathi cavalry would see the weak formation of Syrian infantry in the center and charge. Instead, the horses would fall into a leg-shattering pit half a mile long. Sire's plan unraveled when one of the halfling Thunder Riders tumbled into the trench while scouting perilously close to the Syrian lines. He returned to the scout camp and reported his finding. An enormous debate erupted. Some halflings urged silence. Others insisted that the Karnathi overlords who held their leaders hostage should be punished. The majority, however, reasoned that since the pit would destroy the Karnathi mounts, the Syrian trick was dishonorable and evil. Few things have more value to Talentia halflings than livestock, whether reptilian or equine. So the Karnathi were warned, and the next morning the cavalry charged the flanks, while Karnathi skeletons and zombies fought through the trench. The fight was vicious. Even though they avoided the trap, the Carnathi army failed to rout the Syrians. The Valinor mercenaries, in particular, caused havoc wherever they rode, their skirmishing speed and aggression more than making up for their lighter armor and weapons. The elves devastated the Reckonmark crossbows at one point, throwing the Carnathi flank into confusion and preventing the Order of the Onyx Skull from fully exploiting its advance. In the end, the Syrian lines were forced back, but they did not break. The following day, the pattern was repeated, with Syrian pike and wands holding up the Carnathi heavies. On the third day, the Carnathi undead and riders attempted to bypass the Syrian forces by marching through the night, but Syrian mounted scouts noticed the movement and countermaneuvered. Rather than attack against prepared forces, the Carnathi troops set up defensively. The Syrians, already tired, declined to engage, and both armies withdrew. Sire's triumph in facing down a superior's force through superior tactics and generalship was soon dashed. King Konos had fallen in battle, a fact that was hidden from all but his closest supporters. His page, a lad named Marson, wore the king's helm and armor on the third day. The march back to Metrol became a funeral procession as word spread of the battle's cost. King Konos was succeeded by his eldest daughter, Denel, who was just 17 years old when crowned. Initially, Queen Denel's power extended only to the great cities of Sire, Eston, Metrol, Calazart, and Making. The other great domains of Sire were held by the proud and powerful dukes and duchesses, many of whom were dismayed at the placement of a youth on the throne at such a dire time. As a result, the succession was not a smooth one, and Sire almost splintered. Still, Denel proved tougher than anyone expected, and in less than 2 years, the wayward dukes and duchesses were bound to her in the Oath of Making, a ceremony that reunified the fracturing kingdom.
Like Keeper Tagor, Queen Denel is one of the most important and tragic figures of the war years. Elevated to power at a tender age, she shone in her early years, displaying diplomatic skills beyond her years. She was also celebrated as the embodiment of Siren appreciation. The Queen was an accomplished musician, poet, and debater. In a more peaceful time, she might have become Sire's greatest leader. But, because she was faced with the unspeakable and continuous horrors of war, her passion and sensitivity nearly destroyed her. On more than one occasion, the Queen retreated into stark depressions, leaving her nation adrift. These periods of despairing inactivity contrasted sharply with Denel's manic resolve during her brighter times. Sire's fortunes during the remainder of the war clearly ebbed and flowed with the mental stability of her queen.
In the west, Aundair held steady against Carnath and continued to push against Thrain. In 944, Aundair captured the city of Lathlir without great violence, using a powerful stone-shaking spell to destroy the city gates and then demanding the city's honorable surrender. The citizens of Lathlir, cowed by the flashy display of Aundarian arcane might, chose to surrender the city on good terms. Aundair treated the citizens well from the beginning, though a few reports claim that the citizens were enchanted into compliance. That same year, the Aundarian wizard Kaldor Ravelon, a devout but secret worshipper of the Silver Flame, defected from the arcane guards of Fairhaven to join the Temple Guard Flame Keep. At first, his defection was little noticed, but over the following years, he shared his expertise in animating vessels, shaping soul containers, and infusing metals, and in this way he helped Thrain Magerites devise the Silver Eye Marauder. 2 years later, in 946, the first squads of Silver Eye Marauders were unleashed against Thrain enemies. Others were built to guard the temples of the Silver Flame. In 945, Dazlin, the Blood Prince of Thrain, died in his sleep at his hunting lodge. His son, Erebron Wynern, became the Blood Regent, but like Dazlin, possessed no real power. Erebron, however, soon proved himself a more active figurehead than his father, accepting a commission as captain in the Knights of Thrain. Confirming Thrain's occupation of the Thaliost area, Erebron built a royal estate on cliffs overlooking Sion's Sound, christening it Silver Cliff Castle. The Blood Prince's first campaign began in 946, leading Thrain's troops in the Fourth Siege of Eston. this one a 4-year affair.
947 to 963. Old battlefields and new combatants. After 50 years of near-continuous war, all 5 nations were bloodied and depleted, but none was defeated. Every nation's economy was now committed to wartime production. The militaries had become expert at training new units, adapting to new tactics, and incorporating new equipment. With periodic breaks in pitched combat, the officers found that they could sustain the war far longer than they had previously imagined. Furthermore, with each passing year, battlefield wrongs mounted, and revenge became ever more necessary. Like their weapons, the 5 nations had been tempered by fire and honed to a keen edge.
947 to 952. Cauldron and West. During the late 940s, the battle lines and borders around Vathenrond, an area that became known as Cauldron, changed constantly. Most of these lands had been Braelish before the war, but the nation had been pushed away from Scion Sound for so long that it sought only a more or less secure hold at Lurchen Tower. Sire was too involved at Eston and farther north to do more than contain Thrain's expansion west of Kalazart. In 947, Thrain conducted a campaign of plunder throughout the Cauldron. Monasteries, libraries, treasuries, and merchant counting houses were systematically looted, their treasures restored to homes and churches in Sigilstar, Arldusk, and Flamekeep. Although Keeper Tagor praised the efforts to secure religious artifacts, her blessing before the campaign was far less strident than those of her predecessors, and she cautioned against excesses. In 948, the Siren lords based in Karlazat and Saren decided that the raiding had to be stopped and brought in thousands of Talenta halfling mercenaries. This measure proved quite effective as the halfling dinosaurs trampled their way through Thrain's peasant levies. However, in 949, the halflings decided, in accordance with tribal tradition, that they should march against Thrain to restore Sire's honor. They overran numerous supply points, pillaged Thrain's villages and storehouses as far north as Leski, and generally made nuisances of themselves along the Bray Riverlands. Siren attempts to unify the small bands of raiders into a potent military force that could achieve significant territorial gains proved useless. The halfling raids churned the already bloodied Corvarian heartlands, but changed little in the way of its borders. In 950, the raiding of the halflings and the commissioning of new Siren naval vessels based in Scion Sound made it impossible for Thrain to maintain the fourth siege of Eston. Another conclave of tribes took place, and the halflings decided that they had succeeded in restoring the balance of honor. They departed Sire, taking much food and wealth from the countryside around them. Thrain responded to the tribe's departure by redeploying the troops from the siege into the Cauldron. Soldiers of the Legion of the Pure sacked Starlusker and engaged Valinor mercenaries in Braeland's employ south of Vathenrond. Farther west, Thrain overran Cragwar and Sword Keep, driving Braelish troops south to Hatherel. Braelish reinforcements, buttressed by the Manifest Legion, later drove the Thrains out of Starlusker, but, as had become all too common, nothing was really settled. Braeland's reversals in the Cauldron and west of Lake Bray resulted in a lack of troops. Thrain caught the southern kingdom as it was focused far to the west. A large Braelish force crossed Silver Lake and occupied Silberian, Greenblade, and Erliskar. Resistance proved to be minimal, primarily coming from the bandits active in the area. Ondarian regulars were nearly non-existent in the western reaches of the country, and King Erot was far more committed in Galt and northwestern Carnith. A single Braelish army held all 3 cities. In some, the soldiers outnumbered the citizens for several years until it voluntarily withdrew in 954. In 951, the armies of Thrain and Braeland clashed again at Cragwar and Hatheril. Thrain also moved in force against both Tower Valiant and Tower Vigilant, seeking to crush Onder's strongest border defenses. The year-long twin sieges are subject of a national epic beloved by Ondarians of every station as a reminder of the personal tragedies of war and the greatness of Onder. A concerted effort led by the Knight Arcane finally broke the siege during a campaign that came to be known as the End Year Offensive.
The city of Vatherond had the misfortune to be located in the heart of the cauldron. That the city exists at all today is a testament to the diplomacy and flexibility, some say cowardice, of its leaders. Long a cosmopolitan crossroads between Breland, Thrain, and Sire, the city elders declared it neutral when Thrain first approached its walls early in the war. The Braelish garrison was asked politely to depart or convert into neutral Vatherond watchers. Vatherond welcomed Thrain, Sire, or Breland forces throughout the war, transitioning as necessary to its new overlord. Although its open policy rarely prevented hardship among the citizenry, the city's lack of resistance to the constant stream of armies kept it from complete annihilation.
953. Sack of Westhaven. The first Company of the Sky, an Ondarian Dragonhawk squadron on extended patrol over the northern shores of Karnath, discovered that the privateer port of Westhaven was strangely quiet. No vessels of the Karnathi Navy were berthed, and many of the privateers were absent. The Dragonhawk riders quickly led a detachment of Ondarian ships to the harbor a few days later. Striking at night with magical fire, the vessels burned the docks and bombarded the shore defenses. In the morning, Ondarian marines invaded, supported by Stormhome Wands and Dragonhawk riders. They plundered the city, razing it to the ground. Westhaven was left in charred ruins. It would never recover its former status as a privateering harbor.
"955. Battle of the Crying Fields. Though the Crying Fields had been the sites of numerous battles and would be revisited again in the remaining war years, the 955 battle in that ghastly place is the most famous. This was the clash that gave the area its name. The Thrain legions were formed from 19,000 peasant levy spear and axe, 2,400 heavy horse, including a company of Flamehand paladins, 1,600 veteran archers of the 3rd Athandra, and a company of silver pyromancers from the Order of the Pure. With a strength of 23,000 troops, the faithful were confident of success. The Ondarians should have been led by General Retief Decker, but that noble warrior was assassinated on the eve of battle. Command was quickly granted to the young captain of Horse Lord Darrow. Although higher-ranking nobles were available, the other officers knew and trusted Lord Darrow, and he enjoyed the support of King Eret. The Ondarian order of battle included 400 Knight Phantoms of the Knights Arcane, 2,000 Heavy Pike, 6,000 Lightfoot including Half-Elf and Centaur troops from the western reaches, 1,600 Mage Knights of the Arcane Foot, 2,000 veteran artificer-supported crossbowmen, the famous Wizard Company of the Fairhaven Wands, and 10 lances of the King's Regiment of Dragonhawks. In numbers, they were no more than 13,000, but in quality, they far outshone the Thrain levies. After an hour of maneuvers, spells, and archery, Onder's mastery became apparent. Once the knights and levies had been stung harshly several times, the foot priests and sacrosancts could no longer hold them. The Thrain heavy cavalry began a massed charge, directly at the center of the Ondarian line, desperate to come to grips with its foe. The Ondarians outfoxed the Thrains. As crossbows ripped into the knights' charge, an illusion was torn away, revealing that what seemed a line of light foot was actually the Ondarian heavy pike. The pike countered the cavalry's charge as Dragonhawks flew onto the scene, engaging the Order of the Pure Pyromancers and spreading chaos in the ranks. Although initially stopped, the heavy cavalry reformed with huge numbers of levied axemen. At this point, the Flamehand Paladins unleashed their Silver Eye Marauders, sending them after the Fairhaven Wands. Onder's right flank broke. Miraculously, at roughly the same time, the Thrain heavy cavalry, mauled and spell-scarred from the heavy pike and the mage rights supporting it, withdrew. The supporting axemen could do little but engage in a fighting retreat. Onder held the field, but only just. Thousands had perished. After all that bloodshed, hardly an acre of land changed hands. To this day, the slaughtered of the crying fields reenact their futile sacrifice.
955. Cardinal Ysek's Defiance. The Thrain casualties in the Cauldron near Cragwar and in the Crying Fields were serious blows to Thrain's military. For the first time since the rise of the Righteous Kingdom, real debate arose. Cardinal Ysek, a confidant of the Keeper, and a moderate, spoke out against the carnage, claiming that too many had been sacrificed for too little. Many of the citizens of Thrains privately agreed that the war had become too costly. It had killed and crippled tens of thousands of young people. No village was without a monumental and at least one armless, legless, or blinded veteran. Was that a monument? Still, few were brave enough to speak out against the conscriptions. This made Cardinal Ysek's strident objections even more powerful. It opened up a subject that had been debated privately for years, but rarely addressed at temple or in the public square. Now came criticism of the army, its generals, and the Diet of Cardinals. Many of who had lost loved ones appeared at church to light silver flames in support of Ysek. The hardliners, who apparently had prepared for this day, acted swiftly. A number of prominent cardinals, including a majority of the Diet, warned against displaying weakness and unleashing doubt. Thrain was committed to the war and spreading the glow of the silver flame. Ysek and his few supporters were muted, and dissidents in the military ranks quelled, and dissension in the military ranks were quelled forcefully. Although rumors circulated that the Keeper held Ysek dear, her only statements urged calmness and compromise. Tragically, the internal debate in Thrain was cut short as Breland, Aundair, and Sire took advantage of its opponent's turmoil. Launching offenses of large raids, the three nations sought to finally end Thrain's war. Instead, they succeeded only in rallying the Thrains behind the hardliners. The wavering citizens saw no option but to renew their devotion to the war effort. Cardinal Ysek left Flamekeep with an escort of the Avenging Hand and traveled south to Vathenrond, then by lightning rail to Sharn. Already an old man, he was welcomed there as a voice for peace and became an outspoken critic of the war, respected by many and ignored by the leaders of the Five Nations.
956 to 959. Eldine and Valinar independence. Other than the long siege of Drum Keep and the nearly unopposed Braylish invasion north of Silver Lake, little of military import occurred in the western reaches of Aundair. Still, Karnath, the Lazar principalities, and even Brayland fomented rebellion. From isolated highwaymen, the difficulties grew to include entire companies of bandits and even bandit armies. One seized and looted the city of Alvared in 954, another razed Nirn in the following year. Neither the Ondarian Rangers, the Wizards of Arcanix, nor the court of King Arad could spare the troops to root out the bandits. Every petition to, quote, provide safety on our roads and peace in our villages, end quote, was answered with stony silence, with suggestions that it was a local matter, or with counter requests for additional troops to send to the front against Thrain and Karnath. In 956, the Wardens of the Wood decided to act. They raised troops from the human, centaur, and elf inhabitants of the western reaches, and in a single ruthless season, they found and crushed nearly all of the major bandit armies. Although this act was generally cheered by the Ondarian nobles, a few of the more prescient saw the coming danger and urged the king to dismantle or at least reassign the newly mobilized forces. That same year, another neglected backwater region began to assert itself. Claiming domain over ancestral lands, an army of elf mercenaries made themselves the lords of southern Sire and declared the newfound sovereignty of the Valinar nation. The elves renamed the cities, and a number of Arinal elves were brought in to build things anew in the elf style. The humans of the area raised no objection. Metrol was a distant and far-off place. Queen Danelle and her generals decried the Valinar betrayal, but could spare no forces to retake the land. Indeed, they could ill afford the loss of the elf mercenaries already in their employ. In the end, the new land was not recognized, but no army marched south, and payments to elf mercenaries continued.
The actions of the elves in 956 were puzzling. A people devoted to battle, who idolized their ancestors' struggle against the overwhelming might of the Goblin Empire, had never displayed an interest in holding land. After declaring the sovereignty of a huge area, precious few took on even the most fundamental tasks of governance. Indeed, the former Sirens discovered a degree of independence they had never known before. Some have opined that the Valinar warriors actually sought to instigate an invasion, bringing glorious war to the sweeping plains of Valinar where they could reenact the struggle of their honored ancestors. So, if so, they must have been sorely disappointed when Sire refused their bait. Whatever the true objective, Valinar independence resulted in a greater number of Valinar war clans employing House Deneath to broker contracts with other nations. Again, more than a few Valinar bands simply roved the Talenta Plains and other places as a freestanding fighting force, loyal only to their battle lust.
Sire's quiescence in the face of revolt was just the latest in a spiraling cycle. Queen Danelle, frustrated in shepherding her loyal dukes and barons, distraught about continually sending proud young men and women to die in meaningless battles, and enraged by her troops' inability to halt Thrain incursions in the Cauldron, had crept towards an emotional precipice. The loss of the southern territories pushed her into deep despair. Syrian military operations became disjointed as word of the Queen's affliction spread. Syrian nobles stood fast in Metrol, Making, and Seirun, but the rest of the country was largely left to fend for itself. The Queen's authority declined sharply, and the people began whispering, quietly or openly, that perhaps a new monarch was needed. Perhaps emboldened by the success of the Valinar, the Eldeen Reaches declared itself independent in 958. The Wardens of the Wood, under the guidance of the great druid Owain, announced the new nation's neutrality. The few remaining Ondarians were politely but firmly asked to leave. Most marched out. A notable exception was the Lost Brigade of Captain Nathan Sandberg. The site of that unit's defiance was near Mossmantle, in a place now called the Bloody Glen. None of the 400 light infantry under Sandbur's command survived, and the captain himself was crucified on an ancient oak. Unlike Sire, Ondare did not intend to sit idly by while more than half the kingdom seceded. A campaign against the Reaches, however, would require significant redeployment. After years of tenuous occupation and faced with Carnathi forces newly freed by Sire's retrenchment, King Eret finally abandoned his foothold in Carnath. Ondarian forces withdrew to a new defensive line at Star Peak Mountains. During this retreat, perhaps seeking to pacify his enemies, King Eret announced the Syrian claim to Galafar's throne and claimed he would fight only to restore Ondarian borders. His military consolidated, King Eret personally led the army of Western Pacification into the Reaches in 959. Because Eret was unable to reposition more than a fair-sized army from the long front with Thrain, and wholly unschooled in forest warfare, his advance quickly bogged down. Still, the king remained in the area, leading raids and rallying defenses. He vowed no more Ondarian land would be lost in his lifetime. This promise would prove true, but not as he had hoped.
"959. Battle of Silver Lake. After more than 30 years in power, Braelin's King Borinex began to think that his largely defensive approach in the war had left him without a meaningful legacy. He decided that he would bring an army north into the newly declared Eldeen Reaches, offering protection and a civilizing force. With great fanfare, he gathered 2,000 well-trained heavy horse, 2,000 dragoons, 7,500 heavy foot, 500 Brailish rangers, 4,000 crossbowmen, and 2 companies of wands, the Rowett wands and the Sharn towers. The newly independent wardens of the wood had no interest in trading one uninvolved royal for another. Although pressed by King Eret's campaign in the north, they called upon forest denizens to counter the Brailish on the north shore of Silver Lake. The Eldeen defenders numbered 20 heavy treant shock troops, 300 satyr skirmishers, 900 centaur light horse, 3,300 human infantry, 1,200 elf and half-elf archers, and a company of druid wands. All told, the Eldeen army barely topped 6,000. Although outnumbered, the wardens zealously guarded their homelands and cunningly outmaneuvered an overconfident and poorly planned Brailish incursion. The Reachers drove the Southerners back across Silver Lake. King Borinex was wounded by mage shot and almost captured when his boat capsized. By shedding his armor, the king remained afloat long enough to reach shore, but he contracted a coughing plague and was taken back to Rowett on a litter. Despite the ministrations of several clerics, the king's illness refused to pass. He would spend the rest of his days in declining health. Although largely occupied in the Reaches, Aundair took advantage of Brailish and Thrain distractions and launched a strike force south against the depleted Thrain garrison in Cragbar. After a short siege, that city fell in 959.
961, Year of New Kings. 961 was a year of transition in Aundair, Carnith, and Breland. According to proclamation, King Caius II died as any Carnathi monarch should, leading his troops. In fact, after 50 years of rallying his people in desperate times, the aged king's body could no longer contain his spirit. One frigid morning in 960, while reviewing his conqueror's host, Caius II simply collapsed and breathed his last. Upon his death, the largely crowd Carnathi warlords began to assert themselves. Caius's son, Prince Jaren, was forced to conduct a royal tour to ensure a smooth transition of power. The king-to-be soon found that the nobles wanted to see a redirection of Carnathi ambitions. They despised the nation's largely defensive stance since the triumph at Metrol. In truth, these sentiments matched Jared's mindset perfectly. He assured the nobles that, once he was crowned, Carnathi triumph would soon follow. Aundair and Sire had been beaten back. It was time to retaliate against Thrain's abandonment and insults. After his coronation in 961, King Jaren ordered plants for the glorious assault of Thrain. King Erot of Aundair died fighting against Eldeen raiders in the west. His daughter, Barvet, took the throne, though she was not formally crowned until 962. The new queen avenged her father's death by imprisoning and then executing the ambassadors that the Eldeen Reaches had sent to Fairhaven to sue for peace. The new queen launched another series of incursions into the forest realm. These were largely a waste of soldiers and resources, but some territory that Eldeen at first claimed as its own, notably the Duskwood, was taken and held by Aundair. In Breland, the High Command received ailing King Borinex's approval for an attempt to retake the rich mines of Cragwar, this time from its new lords in Aundair. Although this would prove to be the only major confrontation between regular Aundairian and Brailish forces, the month-long siege featured heavy fighting and much bloodshed. Amongst the dead were 2 princes, Borinex's eldest. In the end, the city was taken and the royal bodies recovered, but the price paid in Brailish morale was high. The entire nation mourned the brothers. The bards soon named them the Martyrs of the Cragwar. 1 month later, the bedridden and broken-hearted King Borinex died. Rumors circulated that he had simply lost his will to live. So it was that the young, brash Prince Borinel was recalled from delving in the gambling halls and ancient crypts of Sharn and told he would be crowned. The 961 coronation was a swift and simple affair, as befitted a land at war, according to Borinel. The new king immediately plunged into the minutiae of running the war, proving himself every bit his father's son. With renewed morale, Breland prepared for battle again. The king also showed that his personal losses had not dampened his lust for life. By marrying a siren, he proclaimed that love overcame any politics.
961. Siege of Shadukar. King Jaren of Karnath was barely 6 months in power when a Karnathi army gathered for the promised Thrain assault. After staging maneuvers around the Wreck and Mark to draw Thrain's attention, the bulk of the Karns headed south, crossed through northwestern Sire with little opposition, then traversed Sion's Sound, landing north of Shadukar. The forced march and Sorewood Skiff water crossing took the city completely by surprise. General Horacht and the Karnathi troops looted and pillaged at will. Hundreds of citizens were massacred and hundreds more died of famine while the Karns ran rampant. As usual, the corpses of the dead were animated to reinforce the Karnathi ranks. The Church of the Silver Flame sent soldiers and knights from Flame Keep to liberate the city, and the siege of Shadukar began. Thrain pressed the Karns hard, but General Horacht proved himself a master of defensive strategy, making Thrain pay dearly for each assault, counterattacking with sallies against Thrain camps and positions, and using powerful wands and artillery forces to keep the muddy ground between the besiegers and the city walls a deadly quagmire. In the end, Karnathi forces retreated by water when supplies and troops finally grew short in 962. Still, the withdrawal was anything but quiet. General Horacht ordered Shadukar be put to the torch after sealing the city gates shut. Although horrific, Horacht's tactics worked. The Karn line of withdrawal was mostly unhindered as the Thrain army, by direct order of Keeper Tagor, focused on the trapped citizens. The spearhead under the command of Captain Malik Alvaro saved many people, but the city fires were too well entrenched. The city was largely destroyed. In the weeks after the fire, the Knights of Thrain and their cleric allies struggled to destroy the remaining undead and rid the city of its Karnathi stench, but the damage and loss of life were staggering. The city never recovered, and most today believe it is haunted by the ghosts of its buried residents. Thrain now found itself at war with all 4 of its neighbors. Even the most fanatical realized that situation would prove their undoing. Unwilling to seek peace with Aundair and unable to make headway with Sire's despairing queen, the Diet ordered an end to raids and other operations in the south. Diplomats approached the new king Borinel. The cardinals promised to withdraw Thrain's soldiers from most of eastern Breland, and quickly implemented that redeployment. The new king and the old priests seemed to put their nation's rocky relations behind them.
(962) Zilargo's Alliance. For almost 70 years, Azil's response when asked about the status of his country's relations with any of the 5 nations was predictable. We are a principality of the Crown of Galifar, and we are loyal servants of the kings and queens of Galifar. This proclamation meant the gnomes were effectively neutral, a useful status for Sire, for Breland, and even for Thrain, all of whom paid enormous sums to Zilargo for siege engines, magical devices, elemental-bound armor and weapons, mercenary companies, and other supplies. This materiel was shipped by sea or lightning rail for prompt delivery, and covered by illusion to disguise its true nature. In 962, however, the Zil mantra changed to, "We are loyal allies of the Braelish crown." To the other nations, Zilargo's alliance with Breland seemed to cement the 2 nations, providing unending gnomish support for Braelish adventurism, led by the brash new king. These fears were realized, at least in part, when the gnomes granted Breland the exclusive services of their bound elementals. This was one of the many factors that led the now awakening giant to such dominance during the latter years of the war.
There's disagreement even among the gnomes, as to why Zilargo's leaders decided to change their tune and formally align themselves with Brayland. Some say that the new Braelish king made threats, that the Zil were making too much money to want battles so close to home. Others claim that King Boronel offered astounding sums of cash and greed overcame them. A few even announce with all sincerity that Brayland had shown that it was the only nation of honor and, as such, deserved Zilargo's support. In my view, the Zils acted no differently from the Reachers and the Valinar. They declared their independence. Subtle, cunning, and manipulative in true Zil fashion, the Alliance reassured Brayland, its former master and the only real threat to Zilargo, while simultaneously breaking from its control. After all, provinces of a country do not ally themselves with their overlord. Only equals become allies. As for the timing of this move, the recent coronation of a young and inexperienced king in Brayland cannot be overlooked. Indeed, Zilargo intrigue is a wondrous thing.
962 to 964. Thrain and Karnath locked horns. Thrain's treaty with Brayland secured its southern border, allowing it to turn its attention to avenging Shadukar, ironically a city that did not even it did not even possess at the war's start. In 963, warships of Thrain punched through Karnath's naval defenses, reached Korth, and began a devastating naval bombardment using fireballs heaved from magical catapults. The attack was not without cost. More than half of Thrain's fleet was destroyed. Later that year, with winter approaching, the 2nd Legion of Autur left the Crimson Monastery and, under the direct command of the Blood of Vol, struck against the Silver Flame in Thaulist. The fighting in and around Thaulist was fierce, with foul and dishonorable practices on both sides. The priests of Vol animated some of the bodies of priests of the Silver Flame, enraging their followers, while the Thrains exsanguinated and burned the bodies of senior Karnathi commanders, preventing their use by the corpse collectors. The most telling results of these Thrain Karnathi campaigns, aside from the heavy losses of life and material, was to reduce the pressure on Sire. With neither Thrain nor Karnath able to mount major offensives against her nation, Queen Danelle spent this time forming and training new armies, incorporating the first Warforged units. These years of quiet and the enthusiasm of her advisor about the wonderful new living construct warriors helped bring the queen out of her soul-crushing despair. Of course, the relief of Sire was not absolute. The famous wizard Hara Drosten failed to prevent a massive goblinoid raid from pillaging Seiren. Although the winged flame returned to drive the assailants away, this key southwest Sire staging point was overrun and many of its people enslaved. This should have served as a warning of the goblins' intentions, but it was ignored at the time as the isolated actions of a few bad apples. Sire would come to regret that inattentiveness.
965 to 979. Rise of the Warforged. Although the Warforged figured prominently only in latter years of the war, Galafar's King Jarrett actually ordered the first mechanical soldiers from House Cannith before his death. These simple golems proved far too reliant on their controllers and thus nearly useless on the battlefield. By 959, however, House Cannith had succeeded in improving its rudimentary pre-war designs and introduced the first Warforged Titans. The house even managed to ramp up production quickly. 12 in the first year, 23 the year after, and 47 in 961. These were still early and unstable constructs, but both Brayland and Sire had the extraordinary sums necessary to purchase them and the desire to work them into their military tactics. The Titans' clear advantage compared to the automatons and clockwork steeds was that they required no direct guidance to operate successfully on the battlefield. They were fully capable of independent operation. Despite their size, though, the Titans were vulnerable to massed troops, particularly Thrain pike and axe counter operations. Of the 400 Titans built from 959 to 964, only 79 were still operating in 965. This depletion was partially a function of their experimental form, but House Cainith also noted that the Titans were nearly always placed at the hottest and deadliest points of any engagement. Both Brayland and Sire requested that the Titans be scaled down and made more reliable. 6 years after the creation of the Titans, House Cainith perfected the modern-era Warforged. Sire was the first nation to invest heavily in the new warriors, and Brayland and others soon followed. House Cainith began selling Warforged by the score, by the hundreds, and in later years by the thousands. In 967, Thrain sent 2 armies into Aundair, hoping to conquer Fairhaven. Aundair met the advancing columns, and though outnumbered, Queen Barvet's troops drove the invaders back. Once again, Aundair's greater expertise triumphed over Thrain's numbers, but it felt its losses, particularly among irreplaceable elite forces, much more keenly. In 968, a young Prince Bruce of Sire was born, named after Queen Danel's grandfather. Queen's joy was short-lived, as Bruce the Younger died in infancy. The Queen retreated to her chambers once again, and her nation feared another emotional breakdown. That same year, Thrain attacked once again at the Crying Fields. Still depleted from its desperate defense the year before, Aundair could not hold the line. The Thrain celebrated their hard-fought victory, and Aundarian forces pulled back to Galt. As the decade came to a close, the South erupted. In 969, a charismatic tribal leader named Haruk led a hobgoblin rebellion. In a single season, the goblinoids took all the lands from the ocean to the River Gaul, and from Sterngate to Kraken Bay. Syrian and Braelish folk who lived there were either slaughtered or enslaved as the nation of Dargun was born in blood. Queen Danelle was still not fully recovered from her son's death, and refused to reassign troops from other fronts to beat back Haruk. Syrians held the line briefly at the Gaul River, but then fell back to Laurenton. Brayland's initial reaction was far different.
(970) Battle of Margul Pass. Dargun's declaration of independence from Sire caused little concern in Brayland. The goblinoids' treatment of Braelish settlers was a far different matter. The public demanded retaliation. A number of nobles and generals, mindful of the trouble caused by the Reachers and the Valinar, and perhaps sensing an opportunity for Braelish expansion without actually engaging Siren troops, pressed hard for an attack. King Boronel, reluctant to commit troops outside Braelish borders, and cognizant of hobgoblin prowess from his adventuring days, was ultimately convinced to invade only after great debate. The High Command claimed that a quick strike through Margul Pass would shatter the goblins and allow for the capture of Lesh-Haruk's new capital at Thrukan Dral. The leaders crowed about the might of the newest and greatest of the Braelish mobile fortresses, Veldaren. Mindful of disquiet among the troops caused by Boronel's hesitancy, the generals convinced him that a showing of royal support was necessary. They assured him that placing the 19-year-old Prince Boromil in the fortress would improve morale while keeping him safe and giving him valuable battle experience. Other than Veldaren, Brayland's forces included 4,000 archers and crossbowmen, 2,200 lightfoot, 400 dragoons, and 2,000 veteran heavy foot, primarily halberd troops, with 300 rangers serving as scouts. The cavalry numbered 400 light horse, but much of the pass was too steep or rocky for effective cavalry operations. The army also brought 40 Warforged Titans and 800 Warforged foot. In all, a Braelish army of more than 10,000 soldiers marched up the pass. Veldaren itself mounted 20 ballistas and fielded the tower wands of Sharn, proud General Minu of Roet, Prince Boromil, and the controversial Colonel Lady Ulrich Rowan, leading the 240 souls of the Ardef Dragoons. Still, Veldarin's deployment was more a result of Braelin's arrogance and desire for an overwhelming victory, rather than of sound military planning. In truth, the fortress was far too large and cumbersome for an engagement in the close confines of the mountain pass. The Braelish would pay dearly for that miscalculation. The goblinoid opposition was neither especially numerous nor well organized, but it was tenacious. The bugbear General Akthun commanded 700 heavy infantry, 3,500 irregular infantry, 2,100 ranged troops, mostly short-bow archers and javelineers, a small company of sorcerers and artificers called the Hammerfists, and 800 wolf-riding cavalry. Akthun's greatest asset was 600 heavy hobgoblin foot, well-disciplined veteran mercenaries. In all, just over 7,500 newly united defenders protected the rebel goblin kingdom, and they were much more lightly armed and armored than the Braelish forces. A traditional standing fight would have been suicide for the Dargun forces, because their ranged troops could not match Braelish archery, and their light infantry would be decimated by Braelish warforged and heavy foot. Cowing his troops into obedience by the sheer force of his personality, the cunning Akthun refused to assault the mobile fortress or charge the columns as they marched east. Instead, the goblinoids used a series of landsides to close the pass and then set up their forces behind them. Given the massive bulk of the fortress, the Braelish spent more time digging than moving. A pattern was soon established. The fortress and human troops slowly cleared rubble and advanced up the pass in daylight, then hunkered down at night. The goblins ambushed outlying patrols and loosed more rock slides in the day, then at night picked off sentries or decimated troops stranded outside the fortress walls. Frustrated after days of slow progress, General Menu ordered a nighttime advance supported by arcane lanterns. His troops met a solid phalanx of elite hobgoblin heavy infantry a few miles below the top of the pass. The 600 hobgoblins were entrenched in a narrow gorge, and they fought viciously. One-on-one, they were more than a match for the Braelish heavy foot, their pikes several feet longer, their tower shields heavier, their wills stronger. They held the gorge for more than 7 hours, until the Braelish found a way onto the cliffs overlooking the gorge and buried them in a landslide. The next morning, the fortress approached the top of the pass, over the bodies of the fallen hobgoblins. Every pilot was needed to steer it through the narrow gap. The mountain walls were mere feet away. Suddenly, it became immobile, and every entrance opened. Either through treachery or superior spellcraft, the goblin hammerfist sorcerers had somehow taken control of the fortress's arcane navigation and controls. Bugbears and hobgoblins hidden in shallow caves along the slopes leaped the narrow gaps, in some cases simply reaching out and grasping the fortress sides, and scaled the walls, swarming over Veldarin. Goblin irregulars and wolf cavalry moved en masse to the open ramps. The Braelish center, almost entirely light troops, fell apart. The Braelish heavy foot, rangers, warforged, and cavalry behind and on the flanks were pinned down by the goblin archers. After a furiously quick assault, the fortress fell. The Dargun army seized the ballistas and used the walls and siege engines to cut a swath through the remaining Braelish formations. The aftermath was a chaotic, panicked rout. The whole venture was surely the most shameful and costly battle in Braelish military history. Of the noble 10,000 who ventured up the pass, only about 1,500 Balscard survivors returned to tell the story at Stern Gate. General Menu and Prince Bormiel were killed in battle. Only through desperate and heroic action did Lady Rowan and her dragoons contain the rout and prevent the Darguls from spilling into Breland. The mobile fortress was overrun by goblinoids as the walls cracked and its bulk settled firmly. Reinforced and entrenched where it rested, at the tightest choke point of the pass, Veldarin became a monumental headstone over the buried hobgoblins. From that day forward, Matshukzal, the stolen fortress, has sealed and guarded Margul Pass. This surprising victory cemented Lesh Haruk's claim to power and is a point of great pride throughout Dargun. Stung by the military disaster, Breland abruptly sued for peace, and Dargun's birth pains were over.
The depth of Boronel's unease about the Dargoon invasion was revealed starkly when details of the fiasco started filtering in. The king's wrath was terrible, but for the most part, it was directed at those who convinced him to launch the campaign in the first place, a group of headstrong generals and nobles. More than a few of those who achieved their position due to birth, bribe, or bureaucracy were sacked. During the state funeral for his son, King Boronel spoke movingly of the grief he shared with so many Braelish families, and publicly accepted full responsibility for the debacle. Echoing long-standing Braelish sentiments, he, somewhat foolishly, vowed that no more Braelish blood would be spilled in foreign entanglements. When Zil diplomats approached him about negotiating a treaty with the Lesh, he agreed.
971, the Third Siege of Korth. Showing some signs of recovery, Queen Danelle ordered a new offensive against the hated Karns in 1971. The Siren forces, heavily supplemented by new Warforged units, once again pushed north and laid siege to Korth. It was never a particularly active siege, but rather one intended to strangle Karnath and slowly demoralize the nation. With its king effectively held prisoner by Siren troops, Sire maintained the siege for nearly 2 years, and King Jaren never left the city. Indeed, he was rarely seen outside the palace, where he consulted with his generals and fomented strategies to repel the invaders. In the same year, Hondair's arcane siege engines pummeled Thrain's western defenses and destroyed Fort Light. The retreating Thrain soldiers entrenched at Sword Keep, keeping Hondair from sweeping across southern Thrain. A nearly simultaneous Hondairian strike towards the city of Darskran was repelled, and its advance into northern Thrain stalled. The winter of 972 brought a rare cold weather assault on the walls of Korth. Sire actually breached the walls, advanced a short distance into the city proper, and assaulted the Holy Gate from the inside. The city garrison, the White Lions of Korth, managed to hold the gates long enough for the clerics of the sovereign host, led by Elinda Roth, to fuse it shut. Meanwhile, the city's defenders quickly converted each noble's solidly built homes into small fortresses containing the Syrian breach. Eventually, the Karns rallied behind King Jaren, Elinda Roth, and the captain of the White Lions, and forced the Sirens back across the walls. The Holy Gate has remained sealed ever since. The cost of victory was severe. King Jaren's eldest son, Prince Drago, was killed in battle. The king himself was wounded, but initial reports claimed it was minor. Soon after, the country suffered a second shock when it was announced that King Jaren had passed away unexpectedly. The same proclamation revealed that the old king had a newborn son, named after his father Caius. This happy news did little to provide the nation with a strong wartime leader, however. Were it not for the Sirens at Karth's gates, Karnath might have dissolved as the warlords began bickering over who would be regent. As Sire prepared another attack, King Jaren's sister, Morana, emerged from Autur at the head of the new army of undead and began marching east. This news heartened the Karns, and they were once again able to hold Korth's walls. As Morana approached, the Sirens abandoned the siege. After coming so close to victory, the 973 retreat was a bitter pill for the Sirens. Queen Danelle ordered the army to entrench in Siren territory across Sion Sound. Given her relief of Karth, it was not surprising that Morana became regent the next year. No sooner had she consolidated power than Hondair struck by sea. The assault culminated in the Battle of 10 Bombardments, a midsummer naval engagement between Hondairian vessels, supported by the Dragon Hawks and the Fairhaven Wands, against the first fleet of Koth in Sion Sound. The Hondairian navy was beaten back, with significant losses on both sides.
974, the Rechenmark Raid. By 974, the former allies Thrain and Carnath were deeply committed to their mutual war. Thrain rallied against Carnath's undead abominations against nature and tradition, and Carnath despised the weak-minded priest worshippers who followed the Council of Cardinals from disaster to disaster. The two countries engaged in pitched and deadly naval clashes. They fought back and forth across Sion Sound to the north. They raided each other extensively, and they aided, when possible, the other's enemies. The rancor resulted in raids against civilian targets becoming more common. In the winter of 974, a force of 50 Thrain Wyvern riders flew over Sion Sound by night. Small numbers and speed kept their approach undetected by the coastal defenses, which were primarily focused on raiding ships. The raiders arrived in the gray light before dawn and set to work, dropping their cargo of firebombs on Rechenmark. They were gone by full daylight, though reports claim they roosted on the ruins of the White Arch Bridge to watch their handiwork. The fires caught hold in two areas: the creosote stained piers of the harbor, and the wood, grain, wool, and cloth of the warehouse district. The city was nearly overcome by flames as the wind blowing off the sound fanned the conflagration. Civilian casualties were high.
The aftermath of the firebombing of Rechenmark keenly reveals the ongoing struggles within Thrain. Military explanations that fire is a divinely sanctioned weapon and this was our vengeance for Shadukar were undermined when Keeper Tagor issued a lengthy letter of regret. Brayland, Sire, Onder, Zilargo, and even nobles of the dragon-marked houses responded favorably to the Keeper's words, but warned that if such an assault were repeated, Onder, Brayland, Sire, and Carnath would unite to burn every city of Thrain to its foundations. Ultimately, Keeper Tagor used the outcry against the incident to remove several hardliners from positions of influence in her government. Even so, in later years, as the militants began to reassert themselves, the anniversary of the firebombing was declared a national holiday, and it is still celebrated to this day.
975 also saw the sorry remnants of Onder's army of Western pacification retreat east of the Wynern River. The stories those soldiers brought with them included trees that decapitated comrades, impossible elf archery, and the poisonings of springs. After the retreat to safer ground, they quickly recovered their morale but refused to return west. They significantly bolstered Onder's efforts in the east and south, but the Eldine was basically abandoned. In 976, Regent Marana of Carnath stunned her country by outlawing the Order of the Emerald Claw. Though internal grumbling about influence of the Emerald Claw had long existed, none foresaw the regent's seizing of the Order's barracks and arresting of its most active knights. Some members were imprisoned for years, others were tried, convicted of treason, and executed. This blow against the Order reduced the direct influence of the blood of Vol at the highest levels of Carnath's aristocracy, and enhanced the monarchy, but the Emerald Claw was far from destroyed.
(976 to 980). Thrain's many enemies. By 976, Keeper Tagor's attempts at moderation sparked a visible backlash within Thrain. The militants rallied around a zealous crusader, the young and newly invested Cardinal Crozon. Just as the Keeper launched a campaign to reaffirm the long-standing ceasefire with Brayland, in 14 years, this agreement had been bent on both sides by raids and border skirmishes, but it had not been broken. And even offer concessions to win peace with defensive Sire, Crozon and his supporters quickly quashed the plan. A new southern campaign would be commenced. Brayland had been weakened by its losses in Dargun. Once again, nationalism and rigidity overwhelmed diplomacy, or even common sense. In 976, a Thrain offensive pushed south, retaking the buffer zone created by the ceasefire with Breland. King Boronel reacted forcefully, rushing north with an army that included large numbers of newly purchased warforged. The massed Thrains crossed Bray River and recaptured Vatharond, but could move no farther southwest. King Boronel, his personnel guard, and the warforged regiments seemed to be everywhere. The losses among the warforged were heavy, but Thrain's army was ultimately forced back beyond Lurching Tower. The battle is most remembered for the personal bravery of Boronel, leading from the front and determined to hold the line against the invaders. In the aftermath, the king's praise for the warforged soldiers was unalloyed. Those few who survived the battle were assigned to his personal guard, and even more Braelish funds were earmarked for House Cainith coffers. In 978, Thrain's attitude again changed. The Keeper succeeded in negotiating a delicate alliance with Sire. Although Thrain had pillaged eastern Sire repeatedly, all Sirens knew that Karrnath was the true evil. The two nations began preparations for a joint attack north. Sire even convinced Aundair to briefly cease operations against Thrain and aid in Karrnath's death blow. Before the invasion could be launched, however, the new alliance collapsed. A series of minor Braelish raids and troop movements in the south threatened to escalate into a larger conflict. Rather than back down and even withdraw against Braelish aggression, Thrain's militants demanded that Sire commit forces to beat back Breland. Sire had no interest in aiding Thrain against its relatively peaceful eastern neighbor. Queen Danelle's refusal of aid was trumpeted as an unforgivable insult by the most inflexible cardinals. When Thrain's troops, depleted by the shift of personnel to Thaliost, were forced to abandon Vatharond and withdraw to Arthon Keep, the denunciations against Sire were exceedingly harsh. Thrain withdrew its diplomats and military planners from the joint Karrnathi campaign. Embarrassed by Thrain's abrupt change in stance, Sire decided to retaliate. A Siren army, supported by masses of warforged, laid siege to Arthon Keep in 979. Once the gates fell and the keep was theirs, the Sirens did not specifically order their warforged to stand down. In an extremely unemotional and mechanical manner, fully compliant with their training, the living constructs massacred the majority of their fleeing enemies, running them down for miles and taking no prisoners. Siren apologists later insisted that the warforged units were designed as overly aggressive by House Cainith, but the damage to the reputations of both Sire and all warforged was severe. Sensing Thrain weakness, the Karrnathi navy worked feverishly that winter to build additional troop barges. In the early spring of 980, as soon as the weather on Sion's Sound cleared, General Vedim Ir-Omik led both living and undead Karrnath legions back to the Shadukar Peninsula. The Karns overran Olath and besieged Angvar Keep. General Omik held the area for a year, but the siege was ultimately unsuccessful. Despite a small garrison, the Thrain had strong walls and plentiful supplies of courage, no doubt buttressed by a fear of Shadukar-like massacre. In time, the Karns declared victory and sailed back to Korth. All in all, the years up to 980 proved that any peace with Thrain was exceedingly fragile. Thrain's hardliners took advantage of this time, and the attacks against their nation, to regroup, reassert themselves, and rail against sentiments of weakness and concession.
980 through 992. Breland Riven. The last full decades of the war saw Breland rise to a summit of power and influence, only to tumble to its lowest ebb. The splintering that had plagued Sire and Aundair earlier would arrive with a vengeance in the south.
980. Succession and retrenchment. In late 979, Queen Barvet of Aundair succumbed to a magical illness. Rumors spread that Emerald Claw assassins had struck again, perhaps hoping to restore their favor with the Karrnathi monarch. In any event, the transition of power of Barvet's daughter was relatively smooth, and Queen Orala was crowned in 980. The new queen found herself ruling a nearly ruined country. The sheer attrition of decades of war, plus the long time required to train adepts, mage rites, and other skilled personnel, as well as to raise dragonhawks, meant that replacing losses was difficult, particularly when compared to Thrain's levy infantry or even Carnathi bone knights. The quality of Ondarian troops and their arcane support was at its lowest ebb. Auralia's desperation was reflected in her initial actions. She sent envoys to her enemies seeking a ceasefire. The queen tapped her most skilled and intelligent diplomats and instructed them to, at the very least, delay as long as possible. Meanwhile, Aurala contacted the Lazar pirate barons, the Valinar elves, and the Talentia halflings about hiring mercenaries from among their numbers. The queen might even have approached the dragons of Argonison and the warlords and abominations of the demon wastes. Sire was dismayed when word spread that Aurala had recognized Valinar's independence as a negotiation ploy in securing the elves' aid. The actions of Onder's new royal achieved their results. Over the next several years, Ondarian forces gained time to recover some measure of their morale, expertise, and numbers. The primary cause, however, was cautious generalship. As Sire, Carnath, Thrain, and Braeland wore out one another with regular assaults, Ondar ceased offensive operations, entrenched, and rebuilt. Ondarian diplomacy mostly bought time. Although numerous peace negotiations were started, little was accomplished. In all, Queen Aurala showed herself a wily fox indeed. The early years of Aurala are still remembered as a time of relative peace and rebuilding in Ondar.
Perhaps the most enduring alliance during the last war was that between Ondar and Sire. From King Rogar's initial support of Queen Mishan, relations reached a high point when Queen Rayla married Siren Prince Degan and bore a son. Still, the long war years frayed and eventually undermined even this friendship. In 958, King Eret of Ondar renounced his support of Sire's ambitions. Toward the end, Queen Aurala's recognition of Valinar essentially ended cooperation between the countries. Although Ondar sent no troops into battle against Sire, its rejection of all but a handful of Siren refugees at the war's end showed just how far relations had deteriorated.
982. Thrain's Messengers. 982 brought a major conflict to the south. Early that summer, Darguls under the direct command of warlord Undral Okchesser conducted an ill-advised attempt to seize territory west of the mountains. Marching out by night from Atshukzal, the stolen fortress, the goblinoids hoped to slip past unnoticed, past Braelish lines. Keen-eyed Braelish rangers saw the dispersed army, however, and hurried to warn every Braelish legion from Vatharond to Sharn. Boronel rushed from Browet, and his army met the goblinoids between the summit of Dargon's Crown and the Faded Forest. The Darguls were defeated in a classic pincer attack that collapsed both their flanks and captured hundreds. Surprisingly, Boronel tempered his victory with cunning. Rather than hold the goblinoids prisoner, or even slaughter them in an act of vengeance, the king sent negotiators to Lesharuk. Braeland offered the return of the troops in exchange for a secret alliance between Braeland and Dargun against Thrain. Boronel's only demand was the removal of warlord Undral Okchesser from power, a demand that Lesharuk had little difficulty imposing on the disgraced leader. Taking advantage of Braeland's distraction with Dargun and Onder's continuing retrenchment, Thrain crossed Sion Sound and launched a massive western offensive against Sire in the summer of 983. This undertaking was spearheaded by a squad of 4 Archons, Celestials from the plane of Shavarath, called the Messengers, divine generals who were believed to have arrived in response to Siren and Carnathi depredations against Thrain. The Archons rallied the Thrains to a degree not seen since the days of the Righteous Kingdom, but they demanded far greater discipline. Excesses caused by overzealousness would not be tolerated. The messengers rode at the forefront of 4 great armies: the army of the Ascended, the Righteous Legion, the Legion of True Brethren, and the army of the Eastern Crusade. Together, these forces totaled over 100,000 soldiers. The Great Eastern Crusade was a smashing success, capturing Eston's valuable iron and adamantine mines. The city and House Cannith's busy creation forges held out, but in a greatly reduced state. The Thrain legions then seized Calazard. The city threw open its gates in surrender and threatened Svos. Bad weather, long supply lines, and a courageous rearguard action by Sire's young general Alvos Brilik forced a halt to operations until the spring. During the next campaign season, the messengers secured mysterious goals of their own, involving large trunks laden with books and other items. The messengers also recovered certain swords, spears, armor, and chalices that were considered holy relics. As a result, on Midsummer Day 984, the messengers ordered the 4 armies to return to Thrain. Despite some resistance from a vocal minority that hoped to occupy Siren territory permanently, most of the troops turned around and marched back home in time for the harvest. The Legion of True Brethren remained behind to hold the area around Eston until later that winter.
Thrain's retreat from an essentially prostrate sire puzzles military historians to this day. Why give up when victory was at hand? Why not hold what was gained? The messengers never explained, and after they returned to Flamekeep, they vanished forever. The Keeper, the Diet, and the Council of Cardinals refused to answer any questions about the incident, waving it off as a matter of the interests of the faith and state. A few of the more daring nobles and commanders in Thrain grumble about this retreat, saying that the tragedy of the Mournland would never have occurred if Thrain had simply occupied the Siren heartland.
985 to 986. Brayland fractures. The messenger's invasion unnerved Brayland, because it showed that Sire was vulnerable and that Thrain was far stronger than anyone suspected. In 985, King Borinel called on Lesh to uphold his secret treaty and join an invasion of Thrain. Haruk kept his word, but the shrewd hobgoblin leader was really just acting in his own interests. In fact, the High Warlord was entirely pleased to have his nation treated as an equal and sovereign state. His followers' support stemmed mostly from promises of plunder. Supplemented by the Goblinoids, Brayland took the Bray Crossings Bridge, seized Castle Rowanwatch in a night assault, and made long-term plans to hold Old Brayland. It had been, after all, Braylish land only 2 generations prior. Braylish troops operated mostly during daylight while the goblins raided at night, and the combination was too much for the Thrain forces. For almost 3 years until the Battle of Cairn Hill, Dargun and Brayland secured the area. In 986, a trio of hags known as the Daughters of Sorakel arrived in far western Brayland. Accompanying them was an army of monsters from their former lands. As they moved east, countless others joined them. The regiments of trolls, ogres, and gnolls overran settlements through the area west of the Greywall Mountains. The limited garrison troops of the distracted Brayland proved little opposition. Report even surfaced that detachments of Karnathi troops, living and undead, were openly attacking Braylish positions and fighting beside the monsters. That same year, King Borinel championed legislation in the Braylish Parliament known as the Warforged Decree, recognizing Warforged as sentient beings and granting them the rights afforded to all Braylish citizens. The law was set to take effect upon the cessation of hostilities between all 5 nations. By emancipating the Warforged conditionally, the decree guaranteed their service for the duration of the war while providing powerful motivation for them to remain committed to the Braylish cause. As intended, it also attracted Warforged from other nations to Braylish banner. Finally, 986 starkly revealed an independence that had long been poorly concealed. The sea barons of the Lazar principalities, defanged by King Galifar and relatively tame for centuries, had been reawakened by the war. During decades of raiding, pirating, smuggling, and pillaging, the princes had been accepting letters of marque from all sides. In 986, however, the powerful Prince Rhaegar gathered a unified fleet and began to hunt en masse. The self-proclaiming Wynaran Scion proved time and time again that his ships could match any regular navy. By his deeds and words, Rhaegar showed that Lazar would bend knee to no outsider. From that point on, no body of water was truly secure.
987, Battle of Cairn Hill. Raylan's high point, the occupation of the formerly lost lands in Thrain, came to an end in 987 at the Battle of Cairn Hill. General Nystrom Shadar of Thrain, later the spymaster of the realm and chief of the Argentum, defeated Breland and its allied Darguls on the fields of Roan, just south of Cairn Hill. The Battle of Cairn Hill is remembered both for its size and because it was fought between two veteran and highly decorated armies. As a result, the intense fighting lasted 4 days before a result could be determined. General Shadar's forces included all 1,700 paladins of the Avenging Hand of the Eternal Flame, and Cardinal Mockton's exultant guards, 1,500 elite heavy foot. The Thrain Order of Battle also included 22,000 hardened levy spear and axe, 4,000 pike, 6,500 veteran archers, 3 companies of the Order of the Pure, and an additional 3,300 veteran heavy cavalry. In total, Thrain brought over 38,000 troops to the field. Breland fielded just as many veterans, including such famous companies as the Grey Geese Archers, the Blues and Irons Dragoons, and the Roses of Sharn, a company of all-female wands. Their troops also included 600 Rangers, 2,000 Dragoons, 2,900 heavy cavalry, 14,000 light and medium foot, 2,500 war-forged heavy foot, 6,000 pike, 5,200 mage right-supported veteran archers, 3,000 veteran crossbowmen, and 300 Zalargo mercenary wands. The supporting Dargoon mercenaries numbered roughly 5,500 Lightfoot goblins and 2,000 heavily armed and armored hobgoblins and bugbears. Totaling 44,000, the Braelish army actually outnumbered the Thrain levies, a rare event indeed. King Boronel also dispatched Kidris, the first and most celebrated of the floating fortresses. The battle's first day was spent in skirmish, scouting, and the use of wands and archery. The few clashes were quickly broken up by reinforcements or maneuver. Neither commander seemed ready to commit his troops fully. The second day saw the heavy use of cavalry to strike at perceived weak points. The next day began well for Breland with a volley of archery and arcane fire, the latter provided by Kydris, the Zilargo wands, and the Roses of Sharn. The Darguls acquitted themselves admirably at first, pressing the Thrain lines. Then word spread that Thrain cavalry riding hard was threatening the Dargoon plunder-laden baggage train. Many goblin irregulars abandoned the line to rush in defense of their loot. This spontaneous retreat drew Kydris and the Braelish pike out of position to cover their right flank. Worse still, a piloting error caused Kydris to plow into the ground as it attempted to quickly shift position. Thrain levies, the exultant guards' heavy foot, and archers exploited the resulting gaps and succeeded in overrunning the grounded fortress, destroying its delicate control mechanisms and rendering it no more than a large, hollowed-out rock. Braelish reserves were required just to stave off collapse. When the sun set, the Thrain cavalry and paladins had been driven away from the baggage train, but the very last Braelish reserves had been committed. That evening, the Braelish and Dargoon sides exchanged bitter words. Only a desperate, divided we fall appeal prevented massed goblin nighttime retreat. As it was, several thousand goblinoids disappeared into the dark. The battle continued to the fourth day. The remaining goblins were angry and fought with great spirit, cutting horses out from under Thrain paladins and using oil grenadiers effectively against Thrain pike. But it was not enough. The Braelish command realized that it had insufficient forces to exploit any gains or address any weaknesses. Shortly before noon, the order was given for the Braelish and Dargoon forces to withdraw. They did so in good order, and by direct order of the Keeper, the forces of Thrain declined to follow. This was later proclaimed a gallant gesture, but many say Thrain's army was so badly bloodied and exhausted that pursuit was nearly impossible. Braylon tried to paint the Battle of Cairn Hill as a victory based on Thrain's casualties, but the loss of Kydris and the sole presence of Thrain forces on the field of battle at the end belie the claim. The defeated armies retreated to Castle Roanwatch, and later to the Lurching Tower. This was Braylon's last large-scale invasion of Thrain territory, and also the end of Braelish cooperation with the Darguls. During the retreat, goblinoid slave-takers dragged along chain lines of Thrain peasant property. The Braelish demanded that the Darguls release their human plunder, but they refused to abandon their most valuable chattel. This resulted in a small skirmish, often called the Slave Battle. From that point forward, the two armies marched in different directions.
(987) Droam lost. The loss of Old Braylon was not the only one King Borenel suffered at this stage. The slow but steady erosion of Braylon's western flank was becoming critical. The king decided he could no longer defend the western plains. He ordered Braelish rangers to escort all human settlers to safety in 987. The bards recount numerous tales of the rangers' bravery, but their most fantastic yarns concern King Borenel's personal defeat of an ogre champion, which allowed the last sizable group of refugees to escape across the mountains. Troops sealed off the land west of the Grey Walls. With the last of the foreigners captured, killed, or driven off, the daughters of Sora Kell proclaimed a new state of Droam. The three hags extended their claws over every nook and cranny of their land, channeling the monster's bloodlust. The daughters commissioned House Tharashk to broker mercenary contracts for the most aggressive. By the war's end, such units could be found among Sire and Karnath forces. Aundair used Droamite mercenaries regularly in the Elden Reaches.
988. Enemies shift. In an effort to replace the unreliable goblinoids, Braylon contracted House Caneth about stepping up the delivery of Warforged. King Borenel was politely informed that production was running at full capacity and that the majority of the troops were pledged to Sire. Although there had been no true hostilities between Braylon and Sire in decades, this news worried Borenel. He decided to seek greater help from House Denheath. The house offered a fairly large number of Valinar elves. Better yet, war leaders Sheriff Valendel had given his dragon-marked brokers permission to lower the asking price for any country willing to formally recognize Valinar claims to Southern Sire. King Borenel was sorely tempted by the terms. His treasury was significantly depleted. He reasoned that Sire had made no move to retake the Valinar territory and that Queen Danelle's statements on the subject remained ambiguous. Furthermore, Sire's failure to support Braylon's aborted efforts in Dargoon or its assaults on Thrain showed that it was no true friend of Braylon. After a great debate with his advisors, the adventurer king agreed to the Valinar proposal. Braylon's proclamation seriously undermined Queen Danelle. Vidalia pressed Sire for a final statement on the issue, using highly inflammatory language. Sire would not concede Valinar independence, but it was still not a position to invade. In the end, several Valinar war clans remained in Sire's service, but the bulk of Valdia's elite fighters departed. Braelish-Siren relationships instantly became more tense. just as Brayland was forced to address its lost Dargoon mercenaries. Sire now cast about for additional troops, even as warforged warriors continued to pour out of Eston's forges. The generals knew they needed more, particularly if the Valinar's shift signaled new aggressiveness on Brayland's part. In a scheme no doubt motivated by revenge, Siren negotiators were ordered to secure goblinoid fighters from House Deneath. Lesha Hruk drove a hard bargain. He, like the elves, wanted national recognition, but was mostly unwilling to lower his price. Sire complained, but ultimately paid. Unwilling to fight Onder, Sire, Drome, and Thrain all at once, King Borinel sought a treaty with one or more to allow him to concentrate on the others. With the loss of the Eldine reaches, beleaguered Onder could offer little in the way of aid. There could be no quarter with the monsters of Drome. That left Sire and Thrain as the likely diplomatic targets. Although bloodshed with Thrain was most recent, Sire's plots were deeply disturbing. When Sire refused to meet with Braelish negotiators and Thrain proved more receptive, Borinel pushed forward with the latter. It took time, patience, and heavy-handed tactics by both the king and the keeper to temper passions caused by the battles in the Cauldron and the loss of Old Brayland, but diplomacy actually succeeded. A ceasefire and a pledge of non-hostility was signed with quiet dignity and no small amount of suspicion.
Those Braelish who had supported the peace treaty as a means toward restoring the aristocracy were well pleased with subsequent events. Erebron Irvinarn, blood regent of Thrain, died in late 988 of a sudden stroke, and his daughter, Diani, succeeded him. Since that time, Blood Regent Diani's pronouncements have been far more supportive of Thrain and the Keeper, and far less of the Diet of Cardinals. More than a few inside and outside Thrain argue that the Blood Regent could be convinced, if asked by Thrain nobles and the Church, to return to power. Given the statements of High Cardinal Crozin and his supporters, that appears highly unlikely. Still, neither Keeper Tagor nor her successor, Keeper Duran, have spoken definitively on the subject.
In 989, an experimental House Leandar airship crashed a few miles west of Dashkran. An unbound fire elemental razed a nearby forest and 2 villages before the Rain soldiers destroyed it. The apologetic dragon-marked house made reparations by donating funds to the Rain's war chest. Subsequent tests were far more successful, and in 990, the first elemental airships entered service. They quickly became popular both for reconnaissance and as raiders. Still, their long construction time and high cost meant that their numbers and impact remained small for several years. Valinar troops, as likely roving the plains looking for battle as working in the employ of Sire, attacked and razed Fort Bones in 990's Battle of the Long Night. The Captain of Corpses, a particularly bloodthirsty warlord who led the relief column from Fort Zombie, pledged that the elves and their Syrian paymasters would regret their actions. For the remainder of the war, the bones of all the elves and humans slain in the area would be used to rebuild the walls.
990 and 991, Marana's Follies. For nearly a decade, Karnath had engaged in only minor battles against Onder, Thrain, and Sire, and small-scale raids in the Eldine Reaches, Brayland, and the Talentia Plains. The warlords, though depleted after nearly a century of war, never ceased agitating for glorious conquest and a restoration of honor. Regent Marana proved to be a steady, conservative, and effective ruler during much of her reign. Over time, however, she seemed to change for the worse. Perhaps it was a response to the pressures of constant war, but she evolved into a creature bent on boosting her own power, increasingly paranoid about her enemies, internal and external. Her instability led to 2 enormous blunders in 991. The first involved an audacious and spectacular seaborne assault. In conjunction with Lazar warships and marines, Karnathi Bone Knights and Undead reached the shores of Brayland and launched an attack on Sharn. Initially taken by surprise, the city rallied its formidable defenses, including more than one team of adventurers, and annihilated all but a handful of the invaders. Although many decried the loss of elite Karnathi forces on an improbably Lazar-sponsored adventure, some in Karnath's military applauded Morana's boldness. Her next campaign, however, removed all doubt about her fitness to lead. By late 991, Karnath's treasury had run dry, and, wary of wild expenditures such as payments to Lazar, House Kondarak refused to extend further lines of credit. Furious at the news, Regent Morana decried the Dwarven conspiracy and turned her ire against the Moror holds. The 3rd and 4th Otter legions and a group of elite night raiders were ordered to seize several of the largest clan holdings by force. The most aggressive of her warlords volunteered their personal guards, and 3 actually marched with the troops. With a corps of elite commanders and troops, and a substantial number of tireless undead, the attack might have worked if Karnath had kept some element of surprise. Morana incautiously trumpeted her suspicions and plans, however, allowing the dwarves to prepare well. By the end of the year, a good portion of the undead horde had been destroyed, and the human troops were out of supplies. Very little of the Moror invasion force, and a mere handful of the warlords returned home. Her reputation in tatters and her generals threatening rebellion, Regent Morana could no longer maintain power. Once again, in Karnath's hour of need, a new monarch was brought from hiding, this time ready to assume the throne. It took some time to organize a proper coronation, but in 992, King Caius III's rule of Karnath began. The new king displayed remarkable diplomatic acumen by quickly making reparations and restoring ties with the Moror holds. The king next surprised the nation by marrying Etrigani, an Irani diplomat who appeared in his court. 991 also set the grim fort of Orkbone as the site of Drome's first major incursion east of the mountains. Unlike the attacks that secured the Dromish heartland, this assault was not carefully planned or controlled. It might be that it was more restlessness on the part of the monsters than instructions from the hags that had inspired the attack. In any event, the Westwind Riders and other Braelish defenders, all veterans of the Eldine campaigns, were ready. Brayland repulsed the monsters' march.
(992 to 993). Thrain embraces new flames. Thrain had spent long decades debating whether constructs truly could be worshippers and obedient to the Keeper's authority. As on many other issues, the Diet of Cardinals was split. Supporters of the aged Keeper Tagor in favor of inclusion, but unwilling to directly challenge Cardinal Crozen's oppositions. In 992, the Diet decided that Thrain's need for more troops overshadowed any theological quandary. Its war chest depleted, Thrain somehow gathered the funds to purchase hundreds of Warforged soldiers and incorporate them into its armies on an unprecedented scale. At Keeper Tagor's urging, the living constructs were exempt from long-standing policies requiring soldiers to attend Silver Flame services. Perhaps because their conversions were never forced, many of Thrain's Warforged became quite devout. This shift in Warforged treatment, if not doctrine, would be the last major event of Keeper Tagor's service. After almost 60 years at the forefront of the light, the ancient cleric passed away in 993. The voice of the Silver Flame almost immediately called Jayla Darin as the 13th Keeper of the Flame. As is the case with most new keepers, the preternaturally self-possessed 6-year-old had no difficulty assuming power. She immediately sued for peace with Queen Danelle of Sire, hoping to repair the damage wrought in the failed alliance against Karnath. Not surprisingly, her overtures were rebuffed. The Queen's generals, led by the bold Alvos Brillic, were convinced that Sire could destroy Thrain with an overwhelming naval invasion of Flamekeep, the heart of Thrain's faith. Sire's overambitious and unrealistic plans were leaked to Thrain, and they were never executed. Still, Keeper Duran had no counter to High Cardinal Crozan's claim that Sire was in active and present danger. Queen Danelle remained the sole royal who regularly asserted her claim to the crown of Galifar.
994 to 996. The death of Sire. Even before the day of mourning, signs and portents of the disaster to come abounded. Unnatural foes appeared on long, bloodied battlefields. Strange mists gathered in the lowlands. Odd noises plagued soldiers' sleeps. Then, 2 weeks before the event, many diviners and oracles actually lost their voices or sight. One of the prophets of the tower in Sharn was said to have gone mad. Still, no one understood what was coming until it was too late.
"994. The Last Battle. In mid-994, Sire launched a deep strike invasion of Karnath aimed at the undead-producing crypts of Atur. Dodging around beneath protected Karlakton, a large Siren army conducted a furious assault that left the city in ruins. Unwilling to get bogged down once again in Karnath, the invaders quickly reversed their march and returned home. With a hastily gathered and vengeful army of Karns at their heels, the troops crossed over Sion Sound and pulled back towards Metro. Significant Karnathi forces gathered in pursuit, and a sizable conflict began developing in northern Sire. This left few regular soldiers to protect Metro, the Cauldron, and the lands to the south. Meanwhile, the recent Thrain and Brelish pact remained strong, and skirmishes along their mutual borders were nearly non-existent. The two countries stepped up relations and plotted a joint invasion of Sire. In a measure either of good faith or of brinkmanship, Breland offered the leadership of King Boronel's renowned warrior daughter, Princess Boran, and Thrain countered with Bishop Militant Gradon, a close ally and personal friend of High Cardinal Crozan. Marching south of the usual battlefields in western Sire, the vanguard of the Brelish Thrain army quickly overwhelmed Kenrun and surged across northern Dragoon. Advance forces reached the place now called the Field of Ruins. There, the invaders paused to await the bulk of their troops before shifting northeast to storm-making. The next day, the main body of Thrain and Brelish forces climbed up through the gullies and gorges to higher ground, and cut the Seirun Road some 200 miles southwest of Making. The invaders numbered over 30,000, including 2,000 Crown Knights and other heavy cavalry, 2,000 heavy pike, 4,000 regular foot, and 6,000 peasant levies on the Thrain side. The Brelish army featured 5,000 Brelish First Dragoons of Rowett, 1,500 heavy cavalry, 2,000 heavy foot, commanded by the renowned Warforged Bastion, 3,000 Brelish Rangers and other skirmishers, 2,500 archers, 2,000 Zil Wands, and 3,000 Valinar cavalry. Through a series of quick hit-and-run maneuvers using the tireless Warforged, the vastly outnumbered Siren defenders gave the impression of being a much larger force. The illusion, and the command and control problems it caused between the invading allies, slowed the advance significantly. Given impossible orders to delay and yet preserve as much of their forces as possible, the Sirens performed brilliantly. On the second day, Siren reinforcements from the east made the battle more even. The Sirens held the road north with an army numbering perhaps 5,000 light foot and archers, 9,000 heavy foot veterans, mostly warforged, 2,000 light cavalry, roughly 1,400 untested Jarp hussars and wands, and a detachment of 3,500 hardened Dargund mercenaries. Although outnumbered, the Sirens were defending familiar terrain. Late in the afternoon, their battle lines were holding, and the outcome of the struggle was still in doubt. Suddenly, the sky caught fire, and deep fogs gathered. Generalship, morale, strategy, tactics, all was useless that day. The conflagration that enveloped the field was so bright that it blinded soldiers at Angvar Keep, over the horizon and half a continent away. Both sides died equally on the day of mourning. The devastation was not limited to the battlefield on the Seirun Road, what is now the Field of Ruins. The rolling hills to the east of the battlefield became a plateau of jagged glass. To the north, a chasm opened in the earth, glowing with a cold and purple light. A choking fog erupted in cities across central Sire, killing every living thing it touched as it expanded to define the current borders of the Mournland. Not all of Sire's holdings were swallowed in the dead grey mist. Parts of Valinor, Dargun, and the Talintia Plains were still under Siren rule at the time, but Sire as a nation ceased to exist. Scant thousands of Sirens living at the edges of the devastation managed to flee to safety, and Sirens who were traveling or living abroad at the time were of course spared. Many of these survivors have flocked to eastern Brayland in the years since the mourning, gathering under the banner of Prince Orgev, the son of the late Queen Danelle. Orgev was serving as an ambassador to Brayland on the day of mourning, and now plays the role of a king in exile.
The response to the Siren's plight after the mourning is one of the greatest indictments of Corvair's humanity. Although some did extend a hand to those in need, the war had so hardened the hearts of the citizenry that most refugees were turned away. Far more perished in the days after the mourning than should have. When the extent of the destruction became clear, King Boronel, racked with guilt about his possible role in the cataclysm, was the first to allow unarmed refugees to pass through his lines. He eventually granted Prince Orgev and his people temporary lands south of Staralaskur and west of Kenrun, in the shadow of the dead grey mists that had overrun their homeland. No other nation was as charitable. Keeper Duran spoke movingly about the faithful accepting and providing for the dispossessed, and the substantial aid provided by the purified since the end of the war has gone some way in helping the church's reputation. But the hardliners in Thrain roused the populace with stories of Siren depredations and kept the bulk of the refugees out. Aundair, Carnath, Zilargo, and Kabara established small communities, but again, no significant action was taken. The ruthless Valinor elves slaughtered all who approached their lands. The goblinoids were no more forgiving.
996, the Treaty of Thronehold. Armies of all nations halted offensive operations as word of the disaster in Sire spread. A growing wave of refugees threatened to overwhelm Sire's neighbors. Although the panic began to subside when the mists halted at the former Syrian border, the proud, powerful, ancient nation of Sire had ceased to exist. These events lifted the diplomatic stalemate, and negotiation by all sides increased significantly. Still, given more than 100 years of war, even the cataclysmic events in Sire might not have guaranteed an end to hostilities. As it turned out, a confluence of circumstances and leaders made peace possible, despite the monumental barriers. King Boronel of Brayland, shocked by the devastation and distraught at his daughter's death, greatly desired a pause in fighting. Speaker Duran of Thrain exerted as much influence as she could in favor of peace, and High Cardinal Crozin and his supporters did not resist. In truth, Thrain was spent. Queen Aurala of Onder had a long history of skillful diplomacy, and she was anxious to shift the conflict from the fields of battle to the tables of negotiation, where she felt she could dominate. Finally, and most surprisingly, the old nemesis of negotiation, Carnath, turned out to be a strong proponent for peace. The newest royal, Caius III, advanced a comprehensive plan for the withdrawal of forces and establishment of new boundaries, including the recognition of several independent nations. As a measure of his good faith, Caius included the former Carnathi holding, the Moror holds, among these new lands. King Boronel offered the moving fortress Argonth as a means to ferry diplomats to summits, and pledged that all who accepted such transport would be safe. Immediately thereafter, the initial group of passengers, a team of Thrain negotiators, were slaughtered in a particularly gruesome manner. As it turned out, this setback actually aided the peace process. The heroic actions of a King's Citadel investigator and the renowned paladin of the Silver Flame, Sir Vaylin Killane, revealed that the responsible parties were warmongering agitators from both the Braelish security force and the Thrain delegation. These horrific deeds severely undermined warmongering forces in both nations. By 996, real negotiations began at Thronehold, the site where the war had begun. Working from Caius III's proposal, the participants soon agreed to recognize Onder, Breland, Thrain, Carnath, the Talenta Plains, Zalargo, Kabara, the Lazar Principalities, the Moror Holds, the Eldine Reaches, Dargoon, and Valinar as sovereign nations. When the question of sire arose, Queen Aurala gave voice to the widespread sentiment. Sire no longer exists. The delegates further reaffirmed House Deneth's role as an international police force and granted it full authority to preserve Thronehold. King Boronel's tenacity and charisma led to one minor Braelish victory, no formal recognition of Droam, and one major provision, the emancipation of the Warforged. King Caius III's dedication to peace showed when he continued to exert his considerable force of personality at the peace table, despite a desperate famine that struck his country that year. He was later rewarded when both Breland and the Eldine Reaches offered food to his beleaguered population. The major disputes involved Onder and Thrain. Queen Aurala demanded the return of Thaliost, but was unwilling to concede pre-war Thrain lands now safely behind her towers in the east. Thrain, of course, held the opposite stance. In the end, it was Boronel who brought the two sides together by first raising the issue of Old Breland, and then allowing himself to be talked away from its return if Onder and Thrain essentially agreed to the status quo. The concessions on all sides were ultimately acknowledgments on paper of what had been true for almost 70 years on the ground. The peace was neither universal nor complete. Minor skirmishes and raids continued as the country slowly demobilized. Thrain and Onder exchanged harsh words over Thaliost in 997 and again in 998. Still, the other nations made it clear they would not support Onder, and Queen Aurala backed down both times. By 998, peace was established, if not entirely secure.
The aftermath. The Empire of Gallifrey was finally and truly gone. What would replace it was up to the new nations birthed in the last war. The blade of Gallifar, soundly shattered, will most likely never be reforged. Each of the 5 nations lost much, and none could point to a truly meaningful gain from all the years of sacrifice and bloodshed. Still, each one appears to be laying the groundwork for the next great conflict. Whether such preparations precipitate a conflagration, as happened in the late 800s, or allow for lasting peace depends on the lessons learned in the Forge of War.
One hopes that the last war taught all nations that continental bloodshed solves no problems. It is far easier to identify the losers of that crisis than it is to claim any winners. Karnath began the war unified and strong. It had the greatest military tradition and the most renowned warriors. Its territorial losses in the war were minor compared to other nations, but the independence of the Maror holds and the Talenta Plains did deprive it of significant resources. The most important change was in the nation's soul. By abandoning itself, at least initially, to the blood of Vol and the Order of the Emerald Claw, Karnath bathed in necromancy. Its greatest triumphs on the battlefield did little to enhance its military tradition, since they were, in part, due to massed undead, and more often than not, followed by horrific pillage and slaughter. Karnath's post-war challenge is to restore its honor. Pre-war Thrain boasted a massive population and an abundance of fertile land to support it. During the war, it claimed divine guidance through the Church of the Silver Flame. Tragically, its faith and its plenty inspired it to the summit of folly. The religious fervor that swept Keeper Serene into power featured rigid intolerance and inspired absurd blood-soaked aggression. In the end, Keeper Daran has followed her predecessor in returning the church to strong but compassionate ideals. Still, Thrain's war efforts starkly shows the dark side of zealotry. Its actions up to and including the rejection of Siren refugees have placed a gloom about the Silver Flame that might never be overcome. Aundair was devastated by the war. More than half of its pre-war territories were lost when the Eldeen Reaches seceded and Thrain took Thaliost. Conquests in Karnath were erased by war's end, and depredations in the south soiled its reputation. From a bright and shining example of spirit, skill, and mystical prowess, Aundair was beaten down until it was forced to rely on the main of intrigue and diplomacy. The additions of lands east of Lake Galifar are some comfort, but the nation knows that its lack of natural resources render it outmatched in any war of attrition. Though it grieves and agitates for lost Thaliost, it can do little to redress this grievance. Breland largely considered itself a land apart at the beginning of the war, and it maintained that attitude nearly throughout. Although a great champion of individual rights and national honor, Breland bestirred itself to action only infrequently, even in the face of depredations by the other nations. It also proved a poor ally, switching sides between Thrain and Sire throughout the war. Most tragically, the war might have visited upon King Borinel the affliction of his father, a broken heart. He grieves for his lost relations, and he cannot shake the thought that his army's massive push against Sire could have been the principal trigger of the mourning. Given questions surrounding the aged King Borinel's succession, Braelish isolation has again become fashionable. As for the light and beauty of Sire, all was lost. The shattered kingdom remains only as a hope and a dream in countless displaced refugees, scratching out a living in foreign lands. They are, at best, tolerated, and realize that they can find acceptance in their new homes only by abandoning their heritage. Unadulterated pride on the part of Sire no doubt prolonged the war, raising continual fears about its monarch's claim to the empire. Still, Sire's claims were no more outlandish than others, and bore the sanction of tradition. Moreover, Siren actions during the war rarely dragged that nation's honor through the mire, as was the case with many others. With so much lost and so little to call its own, Sire is essentially ignored by the surviving nations in their games of politics and intrigue. That might ultimately prove their greatest mistake.
I would like to thank our guest speakers, Dame Starling Patton of Thrain and Felice, who keeps the boundary of Thelanis, for their contributions, as well as the nation of Zalargo for loaning us the notes and recordings of historian Augusta Wayne Wockett to aid in today's presentation. It is said that those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. We hope that today's lecture is proof of the dire need to remember our land's history. Take heart, look towards the future, and be well. I have been Lord General Talon Westwind of Sire. Thank you for your time.